Hey, guys. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your story begins in 1584, during what historians politely call a complicated time in Japan, and what you, if you could talk as a newborn, might have called an absolute mess. The Sengoku period or Warring States era was less about polite tea ceremonies and more about who could backstab faster, march armies quicker, and build castles bigger. Basically, it was medieval Japan's version of an aggressive real estate market. Only instead of losing a bidding war, you lost your life. You're born in a little village called Miyamoto, tucked in the rough hills of Harima province. Your family isn't exactly rolling in gold coins. No luxurious silk diapers for you. More likely, you were swaddled in scratchy peasant cloth and handed a wooden spoon to fend off cold breezes. Congratulations. Life hands you your first training weapon at birth. Your father, Shinmin Munisai, is a professional swordsman, and by professional we mean he takes the art of slicing things very seriously. He's a tough man, a stern teacher, and not exactly the let's toss a ball around the yard type of dad. No, his idea of bonding time with his son would have been, here's a wooden sword, Musashi. Try not to cry when you fall over. Affection is rare, praise is rarer, and gentle hugs are pretty much non-existent. But in a brutal, unforgiving world, softness could get you killed. Your father wasn't raising a child. He was forging a weapon from the very beginning. There's a wildness about you. You're not the tidy, well-behaved child who bows politely and memorizes verses. You're scrappy, unruly, and probably smelled like mud half the time. While other kids played tag, you were probably figuring out how to ambush them from behind a tree and declare victory. Subtle foreshadowing for your future career. In short, from the moment you blinked into the blinding Japanese sun, your fate was already whispering in your ear. You were not meant to live a quiet, peaceful life. You were meant to fight, to wander, and to carve your name into history one duel at a time, preferably while looking slightly disheveled. And judging by the state of the country, you were about to get plenty of practice. Your playground isn't a grassy field or a cozy backyard. It's the hard-packed dirt of Miyamoto Village, where the wind smells of smoke, steel, and a little too much horse. Forget lullabies and fairy tales. Your bedtime stories are about heroic samurai cleaving enemies in half with one swing. Your crib mobile, probably a few rusty swords dangling precariously from the ceiling. From the moment you can walk, or rather stagger like a tiny drunk warrior, your father Munisai has you gripping practice swords. While other kids are learning to write simple kanji, you're learning how to parry a death blow. Call it an unconventional education. There's no participation trophy in your household. If you lose a sparring match, you don't get a cookie. You get a fresh bruise and a lecture on why hesitation equals death. Munisai is a hard man. Legend says he won official duels under the Ashikaga shogunate, but parenting wasn't exactly his strong suit. His love is sharp-edged, practical, and delivered with the subtlety of a cannon blast. Praise. Maybe once when you didn't fall flat on your face after a heavy blow. Otherwise, silence. Because in his mind, survival is its own reward. And yet, something in you thrives under this pressure. While other boys dream of feasting and fame, you dream of battle rhythms, of predicting an opponent's next move before they make it. You don't see the sword as just a weapon. You see it as an extension of yourself, like an iron heartbeat echoing in your hands. You are not pampered. You are not comforted. Instead, you are honed day after brutal day, like a blade against whetstone. Even as a boy, you start to grasp the cold truth of your world. Victory is not about being stronger. It's about being smarter, faster, and just a little bit meaner than the guy across from you. The villagers whisper about you. That wild kid with a stare too sharp for his age. That boy who never cries when he bleeds. Some shake their heads. Some nod in respect. But one thing is clear. By the time you are barely a teenager, you are already something different. Not just a boy. Something far, far more dangerous is growing inside you. It happens when you're 13. That awkward age when most kids are trying to figure out how to catch a fish, or maybe survive a spelling bee. You, however, are preparing to commit legalized murder. Welcome to feudal Japan, where puberty comes with a side of sword fights. A traveling samurai named Arima Kihei shows up in town. He's from a local martial arts school, and he's cocky enough to think a village boy would never dare challenge him. Big mistake. Word gets around fast. Musashi is going to duel a real samurai. The villagers gather, whispering and placing discreet bets. Even your own family looks at you the way one might look at a chicken marching into a fox den. They expect a massacre. They expect you to be the one on the ground, bleeding and embarrassed. But here's the thing. You're not interested in losing. You're 13, scrappy, furious at the world, and wielding a wooden sword that still smells like firewood. It's not exactly the stuff of heroic legends. Yet when the duel starts, Arima Kihei does what seasoned swordsmen do. He underestimates you. Maybe it's your size. Maybe it's the fact you probably still have dirt smudged across your face from that morning. Big mistake number 2. Without any formal bowing or dramatic speeches, you lunge fast, savage, raw instinct. You catch him off guard, crashing into him with all the grace of an avalanche. Before the villagers can gasp, before Arima can even pull himself together, he's on the ground, groaning, bleeding, humiliated. A grown samurai bested by a barefoot teenager wielding a glorified tree branch. You don't just win. You announce to the world that Musashi is not a name to be ignored. It's a name to fear. Of course, your father's reaction is complicated. Pride, maybe relief certainly, but also a hint of fear. Because even Munisai can see it now. The boy he forged is starting to surpass even his brutal expectations. As for you, you feel nothing but clarity. You were born for this. Not to farm, not to bow and scrape, but to duel, to defeat, to rise. First blood has been drawn, and somewhere deep inside your young heart, you realize it will not be the last. You think after your first public duel and public victory, life might settle down. Maybe a nice apprenticeship. Maybe a stable job, carving sandals or fixing roofs. Something normal. Not a chance. At 15, you make a decision most adults wouldn't dare. You leave home. No tearful goodbyes. No packed lunch. Just a sword, a tattered travel cloak, and a stubborn refusal to live anybody's life but your own. You become a wanderer, a ronin. In a world where status is everything, where being tied to a lord offers protection and purpose, you choose absolutely none of it. It's like showing up at a medieval job fair, flipping the table, and walking into the woods whistling. Why? Because deep down, if you tie yourself to someone else's house, someone else's rules, you'll never become the warrior you're meant to be. You aren't here to play politics. You aren't here to shine armor and pour sake for some pudgy lord. You're here to master the sword on your terms, or not at all. Of course, wandering isn't exactly glamorous. You sleep under trees, not silk canopies. You eat whatever you can find, which often means rice if you're lucky, bark if you're not your traveling companion. It's mostly crows, stray dogs, and the occasional curious peasant boy whispering, "Mama, why does that man look like he hasn't bathed in a year?" But you don't care. The wilderness becomes your dojo. The rivers sharpen your senses. The cold wind teaches you patience better than any old master. And with every mile you walk, you shed another piece of the boy you were, the village kid with muddy feet gone, the ambitious teenager who beat a samurai. Still there, but growing into something fiercer. You start seeking out dojos, challenging their best students to duels, learning from every swing, every miss, every victory. Your skills evolve fast, too fast for the world to keep ignoring you. People start whispering your name along dusty roads and smoky inns. There's a wild ronin out there, a boy with a blade sharper than most men's minds. And somewhere on those endless roads, a new thought grows inside you. Maybe the sword isn't just for killing. Maybe it's a path to something bigger than survival. You just have to keep walking. If there's one thing that separates you from the other samurai of your time, it's this. You don't look the part at all. The typical samurai strides into town with his hair neatly oiled, his armor polished to a mirror shine, his swords tucked neatly at his hip like badges of honor. Meanwhile, you show up looking like you just wrestled a bear and maybe won. Your hair is wild. Your clothes are torn, stained, sometimes half missing. Your feet are probably muddy, definitely calloused. You are not the carefully curated image of the warrior elite. You are something raw, something far more unsettling. You look less like a courtly samurai and more like a wild wolf that learned how to walk on two legs and somehow picked up a sword along the way. And people notice. Oh, they notice. At first, they laugh. Who could take you seriously? You look like you'd be better suited chasing chickens than facing seasoned warriors. But laughter turns to confusion, then fear. Because once you draw your sword, once you move, all that scruff and dirt and feral energy turns into something terrifyingly efficient. No wasted motions, no hesitation, just pure, unfiltered violence delivered with the grace of a predator. In duels, you don't dance around, trading pretty cuts for the sake of ceremony. You go for the kill. Fast, ugly, final. It's not dishonorable. It's survival. It's the understanding that battles aren't won by who looks best swinging their sword. They're won by who walks away, still breathing the polished samurai. They're still worried about whether their helmet is straight. You're already inside their guard, smashing their pride into the dirt. Rumors start to swirl around you like autumn leaves. He fights like a demon. He doesn't fight to win points. He fights to survive. If you see him, run the other way. You become a living ghost story, passed from village to village, whispered over cheap sake and campfires. But you don't care about reputation. You don't even care about winning fame. You care about one thing only: getting better, sharper, deadlier. Because deep inside, you know the world isn't kind to wolves, and only the fiercest survive. With the open RD as your home and a sword for a pillow, you dive headfirst into a new hobby, challenging strangers to deadly combat. Some people collect seashells. You collect victories, preferably before lunch. It's a simple strategy. Walk into a new town, find the local dojo or the most arrogant swordsman standing around. Challenge them to a duel. Win. Move on. You're like a one-man natural disaster, leaving a trail of bruised egos and broken bones wherever you go. If there were a tourism board for rural Japan, they'd be putting up warning signs. Beware wild Ronin crossing. And the best part, no one knows how to deal with you. You're too unpredictable, too raw. You don't fight by the book, mostly because you probably never read the book in the first place. You don't wear fancy armor. You don't bow 6 times before drawing your blade. You don't politely wait for your opponent to compose a haiku before the first strike. No. You size them up in an instant, find the fastest route to victory, and take it. Brutal, efficient, and without apology. Sometimes you use a real sword, sometimes a wooden stick. Once, according to later legends, you beat a man senseless with a random boat, or you were found lying around. Because for you, it's not about the weapon, it's about the mind behind it. And your mind is as sharp as the edge of a katana, and twice as dangerous. With every duel you learn, not just about technique, but about people. How they telegraph their fear through trembling hands. How their eyes widen a fraction before they strike. How pride always makes them predictable. You're not just fighting bodies, you're dismantling spirits. By the end of your teenage years, your win column looks ridiculous. More victories than birthdays. More bruised opponents than there are flavors of sake. You don't stick around to bask in your fame. No trophy ceremonies, no parades. You just nod once, maybe mutter something profound, like and head for the next dusty RD. The next opponent, the next lesson. Because somewhere inside, you know you're not dueling for money or even for survival anymore. You're dueling because it's shaping you into something unstoppable, something that even you are just beginning to glimpse. By the time you hit your late teens, you've developed a bit of a reputation somewhere between fearsome sword prodigy and that slightly terrifying guy who might eat nails for breakfast. What really makes you stand out isn't just your fighting record. It's the fact that you refuse to do what everyone expects. You don't pledge loyalty to any lord. You don't tie yourself to a dojo or a warband. You are proudly and stubbornly a Ronin. A masterless samurai in a culture where who you serve is almost more important than who you are. This is basically like showing up to a royal banquet in muddy rags and challenging the host to an arm wrestling match. Respectable samurai look at you like you're some kind of walking scandal. No master. No patron. No permanent address. Surely he must be mad. But here's the thing they don't understand. Freedom is your sharpest blade. Without a master to impress, you answer only to yourself. Without political games, you spend your energy honing your skills instead of polishing someone else's boots. Without a castle to protect, you carry your whole life on your back. Light, fast, ready. Sure, life's rough. You don't get fancy armor handouts. You don't attend elegant tea ceremonies where noble women giggle behind silk fans. You don't even get a reliable dinner most nights. One memorable week, you survive entirely on stolen radishes and questionable river fish. But what you do get is priceless. The ability to evolve, adapt, and grow beyond the rigid limits set by tradition. Everywhere you go, lords and generals try to recruit you. Some offer gold. Others offer fine horses, land, silk kimonos. A few even offer daughters. Though frankly, given your wild looks and constant smell of campfire, it's unclear if those offers are serious or just optimistic. And every time you bow, and refuse, because your path isn't gilded in gold, it's paved with blood, sweat, and quiet revelations. You're not here to be anyone's servant. You're here to master something bigger, the art of war, the art of strategy, and maybe the art of mastering yourself. You are Miyamoto Musashi, masterless, fearless, just getting started. Somewhere between your 100 duel and your 1,000 mosquito bites sleeping under the stars, something shifts inside you. Fighting isn't just about strength. It isn't just about speed. It's about seeing the world differently. You begin to realize the sword is only the surface. Beneath every clash of steel is a battle of minds, a silent conversation in feints, pressure, rhythm, and fear. Victory doesn't belong to the fastest or even the strongest. It belongs to the one who understands. So you start thinking differently. When you approach an opponent now, you don't just study their stunts or their swords. You study them, how they hold tension in their shoulders, how they blink when nervous, how they hesitate when the wind gusts dust into their face. You start predicting movements before they happen, not with magic, but with brutal attention to human weakness. You realize a duel is won long before the first blade swings. It's won the moment your opponent doubts themselves. It's won the moment they feel like prey, and you feel like the storm coming for them. In many ways, you stop fighting people altogether. You start fighting their intentions. This is when you truly begin to separate yourself from the rest of the samurai world. While others are busy memorizing ancient techniques and polishing the same tired sword forms, you are inventing something new, something terrifyingly effective. You turn dueling into chess played at the speed of lightning. Sometimes you win before the opponent even realizes the fight has started. A subtle shift in your stance, a smile, a real one, or something close enough to scare the life out of them. An unexpected movement, breaking all rules of style and tradition. And when they fall, confused and defeated, it isn't just because you hit harder. It's because you lived one move ahead and they never even realized it. You start to see life itself like this. Everything is a strategy. Everything is timing. Everything is the balance between stillness and sudden, merciless action. The sword is just a tool. The real weapon is the mind. And yours, sharpened by hardship, hunger, and endless battle, is becoming as deadly as any blade you could ever wield. Somewhere along the endless roads you travel, beaten, bruised, and slightly more mosquito-bitten than any legendary warrior should admit, you have another realization. Why settle for just one sword, when you can wield two? Yes, 2 hands, 2 swords. A revolutionary concept that every proper samurai back in their polished castles would scoff at while carefully adjusting their very formal, very traditional armor. You, however, don't have the luxury of worrying about tradition. You worry about staying alive. You worry about winning. So you start training relentlessly. A katana in one hand, a wakizashi, the shorter sword in the other. Most people's brains short circuit just thinking about it. But how do you parry and attack at the same time? But the styles, the schools, the sacred forms. Meanwhile, you're out in the woods, beating tree trunks into splinters, learning to move both arms independently, flowing like water, unpredictable as a summer storm. At first, it's clumsy. You drop swords, you trip over your own feet. At one memorable moment, you nearly disarm yourself. But slowly, painfully, something clicks. Two swords. Not a chaotic mess, but a deadly dance. One hand deflects, the other strikes. Left, right, left. A rhythm as natural as breathing. You're no longer bound by the rigid patterns taught in dojos. You create your own rhythm, your own style, and soon your two-sword technique, Nitinichi Ryu, becomes as much a part of you as your own heartbeat. The beauty of it, no one knows how to fight you anymore. Single sword fighters are confused. Spearmen are frustrated. Archers don't even get the chance to be frustrated. Your enemies expect one threat. They get two. They prepare for a sword duel. They get overwhelmed by a hurricane. The more formal samurai shake their heads in disgust, muttering into their sake about disrespecting centuries of tradition. But you don't hear them. You're too busy surviving, winning, innovating. You don't fight for style points. You fight to carve a new path through a dying, rigid world. A path where adaptability, not ancestry, is the true mark of mastery. Two swords, one purpose, victory, and you're just getting started. By now you've carved quite a reputation for yourself. You're the storm that drifts into town, flattens the local champion, and disappears before anyone can even start carving your name into a wooden plaque. But eventually, storms need bigger mountains to clash against. Enter the Yoshioka school. The Yoshioka clan isn't some scrappy village dojo. They're elite. They're powerful. Their name carries weight in Kyoto, the cultural heart of Japan, a city filled with silk robes, carefully trimmed beards, and egos the size of small mountains. The Yoshioka aren't just teaching swordsmanship. They're practically an institution. Winning a duel against them would be like an upstart garage band crashing a Royal Opera house and stealing the show, which naturally sounds like exactly the sort of thing you'd do. So you march into Kyoto, dusty, scruffy, and probably smelling faintly of river water and stubbornness, and you issue a challenge to Yoshioka Seijiro, the head of the school. Seijiro is a proud man, and utterly convinced that you are just some wild vagabond with a death wish. Accepts. The fight is set. Formalities are arranged. Everyone expects it to be a swift, embarrassing lesson for you. A public reminder that proper warriors don't get out-dueled by wild ronin. Everyone except you. When the duel comes, there's no elaborate speeches, no dramatic poses. Just you, calm as a stone in a riverbed, facing down a master of high society swordsmanship. And when the moment strikes, you don't hesitate. You smash through his defenses like a typhoon through a paper screen. Seijiro is defeated, not politely, not ceremoniously, brutally. The once proud Yoshioka master is humiliated in front of his students, his patrons, and half of Kyoto's gossip-loving citizens. And you don't stick around to gloat. You don't strut through the streets gathering applause. You nod once, maybe tug your ragged cloak tighter against the breeze, and melt back into the city's shadowed alleys. Because in your mind, there's no final victory yet. Only the next duel. Only the next challenge. You've cracked the foundation of an empire. But you know the Yoshioka won't let this insult stand. Not without blood. And you're ready for them. The Yoshioka school does not take humiliation well. Losing to some wild ronin, a man who probably sleeps closer to goats than golden screens, is not just a bruise to their pride. It's a full-body injury. So naturally, they do what any prestigious institution with a bruised ego would do. They send in the next brother. Enter Yoshioka Denshikiro. You might say Denshikiro is the bigger, angrier sequel to Seijiro. More muscle, more rage, less patience. He challenges you to another formal duel, determined to erase the family's embarrassment, preferably by erasing you from existence. The city buzzes with anticipation. Another Musashi fight. Will the feral swordsman finally meet his match? Will honor be restored? Will someone please pass the sake? You, however, are as calm as ever. If Denshikiro thinks anger is going to win this fight, he clearly hasn't been paying attention. The day of the duel arrives. The crowd gathers. Bets are placed. Vendors sell skewers of grilled fish to excited spectators because nothing pairs better with Mortal Kombat than a light snack. When Denshikiro strides into the arena, he looks like a storm cloud in human form armored and bristling with fury. You look pretty much the same as always. Worn sandals, simple clothes. A look in your eyes that says I've already mapped out 3 ways to end this, and 2 of them are mildly insulting. The duel begins. Denshikiro charges in heavy and hard, aiming to crush you with brute strength. But you light, fast, strategic. Step just out of range, reading his every move like a badly written play. A few exchanges later, it's over. You land a devastating blow. Denshikiro collapses. Yoshioka's last hope crumples into the dirt. The crowd is stunned again. Some gasp, some cheer. Some immediately reconsider their life choices. The once mighty Yoshioka clan has now lost 2 sons to a scruffy, barefoot duelist who probably sharpened his sword on a rock that morning. And you give no speeches, no proud boasts. You simply turn and leave silence steady, like a force of nature that doesn't need to explain itself. But deep down, you know the Yoshioka aren't finished. They have one more desperate move left, and it's going to be anything but honorable. Defeat stings. Public, humiliating defeat. Well, that burns like pouring sake over an open wound. And after losing not 1, but 2 heirs to your blade, the once proud Yoshioka school is teetering on the edge of collapse. They have a choice. Accept the losses with dignity, or throw whatever scraps of honor they have left into a bonfire and gamble everything on one last desperate strike. Guess which option they choose. The Yoshioka declare another duel, but this time it's not a simple man-to-man match. Oh no, they plan an ambush. The target? You, obviously. The goal? Wipe the smug look off your face and restore honor with a hail of swords. Their strategy is simple. Lure you into a final duel against Madashir Kairo, the new young head of the family, a child barely old enough to shave. Thrust forward as a figurehead while dozens of armed Yoshioka warriors hide nearby, ready to strike the moment you show yourself. Fair? Absolutely not. But fair stopped being part of the conversation about 2 dead brothers ago. Now, here's what makes you... it's a trap. You can smell it like rotten fish from a mile away. And what do you show up early, before the ambush is fully set? Before the hidden swordsmen are in position, before anyone expects you, you glide through the twilight mist like a ghost, sword already drawn. Matashikiro barely has time to scream before you cut him down. A clean, fast strike, efficient as a thunderbolt. Chaos erupts. Yoshioka men come pouring out of the shadows like angry ants, dozens of them, swords flashing, shouting, cursing your name. And you don't freeze. You don't falter. You move fast, precise, a blur of deadly efficiency. You cut through the would-be ambushes like a blade through rice paper, slipping through their ranks, disappearing into the dusk before they can even organize themselves. By the time they realize what's happened, you're long gone, a rumor riding the wind. The Yoshioka school, once the pride of Kyoto, collapses in disgrace. And you don't stick around to celebrate. You just keep walking. Because for Miyamoto Musashi, the journey isn't about revenge. It's about perfection. And perfection demands more than victory. It demands evolution. After your dismantling of the mighty Yoshioka school, your legend explodes like a firecracker in a dry village square. Only, instead of awe and admiration, your name carries a new flavor of fear. You're not just seen as a dangerous swordsman anymore. You're something else, something harder to define, and even harder to confront. Word spreads across provinces like wildfire. Musashi doesn't just defeat opponents, he destroys families. One Musashi is worth an entire battalion. If you see a disheveled man carrying two swords and smelling faintly of river mud, run. And here's the crazy part. It's not even that much of an exaggeration. At this point, it feels like armies would be better suited to fight you than individual swordsmen. One-on-one duels, child's play, ambushes. Try harder. Even groups of trained fighters can barely touch you. You've reached a level where facing you feels less like fighting a man and more like trying to fist fight a thunderstorm. Part of it is skill. Sure, your two-sword technique, your strategy, your raw speed, they're unmatched. But the real secret weapon, psychological warfare. Most men are beaten before they even draw their swords. When they hear your name, they remember the stories. The boy who killed a grown samurai at 13. The Ronin who dismantled the Yoshioka like snapping twigs. The wanderer who uses anything. A wooden or a random branch. Probably a particularly angry goose if it came to it. To achieve victory, they step onto the dueling ground, already sweating, already doubting. And doubt to you smells better than victory because you've learned something critical. A sword can kill the body, but fear kills the soul. Sometimes you win duels without even swinging. An opponent sees that cold, steady look in your eyes, that slight tilt of your head that says, "I've already killed you in my mind." And they crumble. Some surrender, some flee. A few bravely charge, only to realize too late that they're charging into a force of nature. You're no longer just Musashi the duelist. You are Musashi the storm, Musashi the unstoppable. And as you continue walking the broken roads of Japan, one thing becomes clear. It will take more than numbers, more than blades. To stop you now, with Yoshioka crushed and your reputation soaring, you could have done what most warriors dreamed of. Found a rich lord to serve, earned a fancy title, maybe even snagged a castle with decent plumbing. But no, you choose the road again because deep down, castles are cages, even if they're lined with gold. And so begins the long, winding, dust-choked chapter of your life. The years of wandering. You drift from province to province like a blade caught on the wind. No plan, no map. Only one constant. The search for mastery. Everywhere you go, you seek out new opponents, new styles, new ideas. Sword masters, monks, spearmen, bandits. It doesn't matter who or what they are. If they know something you don't, you want to face them. Sometimes you challenge them. Sometimes they challenge you. Sometimes you just bump into them while trying to steal a particularly juicy rice ball and somehow end up in a duel. Travel life is messy. Your style evolves again and again, like a river carving new paths through stone. You adapt, refine, and shed what doesn't serve you. You don't duel for money. You don't duel for fame. You duel for the thrill of becoming. Every opponent is a mirror showing you your own flaws. And every time you break that mirror, you come away sharper. Your clothing becomes even rougher, your sword even quicker, your mind even more dangerous. People start telling stories about you. Strange, mythic stories. Musashi fought 3 men at once, using only a fan. Musashi defeated a master spearman with a broken fishing pole. Musashi once stared so hard at a bear that the bear apologized and left. Are they true? Maybe. Maybe not. But you don't bother correcting anyone because you're not interested in polishing your legend. You're interested in sharpening your soul. And if that path leads you deeper into forests, over frozen rivers, through dusty mountain passes, so be it. The road is your home now, the endless horizon, your companion, while other warriors tie their fates to lords and lineages. You tie yours only to the blade and to the endless, hungry quest for something greater than victory. Something like true understanding. And, you're getting closer. As the miles wear on and the seasons blur past you, something unexpected begins to stir deep inside your battle-hardened soul. A longing for something. More. Not more jewels. Not more blood. Not even more victories. Something quieter. Something deeper. Art. It starts subtly. After a long day of training or travel, you find yourself picking up a brush instead of a sword. At first, Your calligraphy looks like what happens when a cat runs across wet ink. Not exactly museum quality, but just like with swordsmanship, you don't expect to be good right away. You expect to become good through patience, through discipline, through relentless practice. Soon you're painting landscapes, hills, rivers, birds frozen mid-flight. The brushstrokes, almost like the movements of a sword, flowing, precise, alive. And you realize something profound. The same spirit that guides your blade can guide your hand. Swordsmanship and art are not opposites. They are twins. Both demand presence. Both demand balance. Both demand the ability to see the world clearly and then leave a mark on it with grace and certainty. It's not just painting either. You carve sculptures from wood. You practice the tea ceremony with the care of a general preparing for war. You study poetry, philosophy, and Zen Buddhism. You become strange in a way, a Ronin who can kill 10 men before breakfast and paint a delicate ink wash of a cherry blossom branch by lunch. Your peers don't really know what to make of it. Musashi, the guy who crushed Yoshioka, the guy who fought Sasaki Kojiro. He's painting now. Some laugh, some scoff. You don't care because you see something they don't. Victory is temporary. Mastery is eternal. A sword wins battles. Art wins immortality. And deep down, you understand something even more important. One day your body will falter. Your sword hand will slow. The duels will end. But your mind, your spirit, your vision, those can endure through ink, through wood, through words. You are no longer just a warrior. You are becoming a creator, carving your spirit into the world, one perfect brush stroke at a time. And as you sit by a quiet river, brush in hand, a smile ghosts across your face. The path is wider than you ever imagined. And it's only the beginning. As you wander deeper into your 30s, with a trail of defeated opponents stretching out behind you like a particularly violent parade, a new name starts to reach your ears. Sasaki Kojiro. At first, it's just whispers and smoky inns and dusty crossroads. There's a man with a blade like a lightning strike. His sword is so long, it could swat a bird from the sky. He's undefeated, just like you. Interesting. You're not the type to get rattled by reputation. After all, you are the reputation other warriors have nightmares about. But Sasaki Kojiro is different. He's not some arrogant dojo master waiting to be embarrassed. He's not a desperate noble's bodyguard clinging to the old ways. He's fast, deadly, precise, and he carries a sword so absurdly long, the Mana Ishizo, the drying pole, that you half wonder if he's compensating for something. You don't say it out loud. That would be rude. Kojiro's style, the swallow cut, is famous. It mimics the movement of a bird's wings. Quick, elegant, impossible to predict. He's not just good. He's a force of nature, a mirror of you, but polished, regal, almost civilized. And in a weird way, you're excited. Finally, a real challenge. Not another pompous blowhard to humiliate. Not another crowd of amateurs to outthink. Someone who might actually force you to reach deeper. Someone who might sharpen you in ways no jewel ever has. Word eventually reaches you that Kojiro has been appointed as the fencing master for a lord. High honor. Great pay. Fresh clothes. You're still sleeping in barns, occasionally using your travel cloak as both blankets. And breakfast napkins. But that doesn't matter. Because paths like yours and Kojiro's are not meant to run parallel forever. They're meant to collide spectacularly. The rumors swell around you like the gathering clouds before a storm. Two undefeated swordsmen, two masters of timing and death. Two legends, but only one destiny. And somewhere inside, beneath the calm and the calligraphy, the old fire stirs again. The wolf lifts its head. The blade hums with anticipation. You smile faintly because you know what's coming and you're ready. The challenge doesn't come wrapped in gold or sung by heralds. It comes in quiet, serious words pass through wary messengers. Sasaki Kojiro has accepted. He will meet you on the battlefield. No politics, no lords, no armies. Just two men, two blades, and a promise hanging in the humid air. The duel is arranged for a tiny rocky island in the Kanman Straits. Ganryujima, remote enough for privacy, flat enough for a clean fight, dramatic enough that the gods themselves might pull up a chair to watch. You hear the details with the same calm you've carried for years, where others would pace nervously, sharpening blades and writing tearful farewell letters. You barely shrug, challenge, accepted. Still, you prepare, but not the way your enemies would expect. You don't spend sleepless nights polishing armor. You don't compose elaborate death poems or fuss over ceremonial garb. You don't even bother getting a haircut, judging by the wild mane you're sporting these days. Instead, you sharpen your mind. You study Kojiro the way a hunter studies dangerous prey. You learn his timing, his technique, his habits. Fast, precise, deadly at mid-range. Good. Because you've already decided you're not going to fight Kojiro at his own game. That will be suicide. You're going to change the game entirely. You ask for a small boat to take you to the island on the day of the duel. You carve a wooden sword, bakkin, from in or during the ride. A simple piece of wood, roughly the length of Kojiro's absurdly long blade. No polished steel. No gleaming armor. Just rough wood and sharpened tin. Because you understand something most warriors never learn. Victory isn't about using the best weapon, it's about using the best mind. As you ride toward the island, the wind in your hair and the salt on your skin, you feel it. The stillness before the storm, the coiling tension of two titans about to collide, the quiet, thrilling certainty that this fight will echo through time, and you smile just a little because you're not here to survive. You're here to win. The boat bumps against the shore of Ganryujima, and you step out, cradling your makeshift wooden sword, a carved or rough and unpolished, still smelling faintly of river water and stubbornness. Across the beach you see him, Sasaki Kojiro. He's already waiting. Tall, lean, composed, dressed in elegant robes, carrying his famous Monahashizaw, the drying pole, a sword so long it looks like it belongs on a ship's mast, not in a jewel. He's polished, prepared, perfect. And you look like you wandered onto the beach by accident after a particular. A spirited night in a tavern. The crowd retainers, witnesses, curious fishermen murmur as they see you. Some snicker. Some shake their heads. He's late. He's disrespectful. He's armed with a stick. Kojiro's lips tighten into a sneer. He's already angry, already off balance. Good. You intended it that way. You didn't come late out of arrogance. You came late to disrupt him, to break his rhythm before the blades even crossed. Because you understand a duel isn't won when the swords strike. It's won the moment the opponent loses control of his mind. Kojiro, unable to contain himself, unsheathes his massive sword in one fluid, beautiful motion. They say the swallow cut, his signature technique, can sever a bird's wings mid-flight. That precise. Unbelievably deadly. But as he moves, something happens. Something subtle, something critical. He hesitates just for a blink, thrown off by your ragged appearance, your audacity, the absurd sight of a man calmly advancing with a boat oar. And that's all you need. You surge forward faster than a striking hawk. Your wooden sword whistles through the salty air. One single perfect blow. The crack of wood against the skull echoes across the island. Kojiro collapses. Instant. Final. The mighty Sasaki Kojiro, the swallow cutter, the fencing master, the undefeated legend lies broken on the sand. Silence falls. Mouths hang open. The fishermen stop chewing their rice balls mid-bite. Even the gulls seem momentarily stunned. And you lower your awe, breathing steady. Heart calm. Another duel, another victory. But something in the air feels different. Heavier. Because today you didn't just defeat a swordsman. You ended an era. And deep inside, you know victory will never taste the same again. Ganryujima lies quiet after the clash, the waves lazily lapping at the blood-sprinkled sand, the wind whispering through the grass as if afraid to disturb what just happened. You stand over Sasaki Kojiro's fallen body, the crude wooden sword still heavy in your hand. Victory. Complete. Undeniable. But as the adrenaline fades, something colder seeps into your bones. You look around. The witnesses, the samurai retainers, even the fishermen, all stare at you like they're seeing a ghost. Not a man. There's no triumphant cheering, no celebratory cries. Only silence. A heavy, uncertain silence that clings to your skin more tightly than sweat. Because today wasn't just another duel. It wasn't a local champion or an arrogant heir you bested. It was him, Sasaki Kojiro, the sword saint in his own right, the only man they thought could stand as your equal. And now he lies there, crumpled like a broken fan. You realize something in that moment. Something you hadn't truly understood until now. At a certain height, there are no more rivals. There are no more equals. Just a lonely peak high above the clouds and you standing there alone. You turn without ceremony and walk away, leaving the body behind, leaving the stares, the judgment, the whispered legends already beginning to sprout like weeds in the sand as you board the small boat to return to the mainland. The wooden or-turned sword clunks against the side of the vessel, awkward and out of place, just like you feel inside. The boatman, an old man with weathered hands, rose silently, not daring to speak. You stare back at the shrinking island, a small speck of land where two destinies clashed and only one survived. Ganryujima will forever be tied to your name. Poets will sing of it. Scribes will exaggerate it. Old men will argue over it in smoky inns you'll never visit. But you feel no joy, no pride, only a sense of something irreversible. The path you walk now isn't the path of a swordsman seeking glory. It's the path of a swordsman seeking meaning. In a world where fewer and fewer opponents remain, the air creaks, the water shimmers, the wind carries your name across the waves, and you wonder, quietly, what's left to conquer. When you've already defeated everything, Kojiro's death lingers in the air long after you leave Ganryujima. Not as a triumph, not as a trophy, as a weight. You try to brush it off at first. Another duel, another victory, just like the dozens before it. But this one is different because Kojiro wasn't a thug from some backwater village. He wasn't an overconfident dojo master with more pride than skill. He was a true swordsman, a mirror of your own relentless pursuit of mastery. And you killed him not just physically, but spiritually. You shattered a man who, had the world been kinder, might have stood beside you, not across from you. People celebrate, of course. They retell the story in 100 different ways. Musashi arrived late to unnerve Kojiro. Musashi carved in or sword on the way just to mock him. Musashi struck him down before Kojiro could even blink. The tales grow bigger, louder, and more ridiculous. By next month, someone will probably claim you rode to the island on the back of a giant fish and fought with a tree trunk. You hear these stories. You even smirk at a few of them. But deep inside, none of it feels like victory. It feels like the closing of a door you can never open again. With Kojiro gone, the world seems smaller, duller, a little emptier. Because now you know. There are fewer and fewer men left who can meet your blade with true understanding. Fewer who can dance on the edge of death with you, seeing the same beautiful, terrifying truth. You didn't just defeat Kojiro, you outlived him, and somehow that feels like a heavier burden. Late at night, sitting by a lonely campfire, you catch yourself replaying the fight in your mind. Not with regret, not with guilt, but with a kind of aching respect. Kojiro was your greatest challenge, and now he's a ghost that will walk beside you for the rest of your days. You stare into the flames. The road ahead stretches onward, longer, lonelier, quieter, and somewhere inside you understand. The more victories you claim, the more solitude you inherit. It's not the duels that will be your undoing. It's the emptiness they leave behind after Ganryujima. The world hails you as unstoppable. The swordsman who felled Sasaki Kojiro, the ronin who fears nothing, the legend who walks among mortals. And yet, for all the admiration, all the whispered awe that trails your footsteps like dust, you feel nothing. Victory used to burn bright in your chest, a fire fueled by the thrill of survival, the hunger for mastery. Now it flickers low. Starved of meaning, you wander through villages where children pretend to be you, swinging sticks and shouting your name. At inns, drunkards lift their cups in your honor, spinning tales so grand that even you wouldn't recognize yourself in them. Musashi fought 10 men at once and didn't spill a drop of his tea. He can slice a falling leaf in half from 20 paces away. He once beat an entire dojo using nothing but his glare. You smile politely when you hear these stories. You nod, you bow, you drink their rice wine. But inside, it's like chewing ash because you know the truth. They don't. The duels were never about fame, never about building a legend. They were about the pursuit, the endless, painful, beautiful pursuit of something perfect, something whole. And now that pursuit feels hollow. You used to dream of opponents worthy of you. Now you dream of quiet rivers, empty paths, the wind through pine trees, because there's no opponent left to chase. The world is too small now, too fragile. You watch other warriors polish their armor, polish their reputations, chase titles, and court favor. You feel like a wolf among house dogs. You don't belong in courts or castles. You don't belong on thrones or under banners. You belong nowhere and everywhere. Victory, you realize, is a strange sort of death. The death of striving, the death of hunger. You have won too much, and the price of that is solitude. Deep, vast solitude that no drink, no song, no cheering crowd can ever fill. So you keep walking, not toward glory, not toward battle, but toward something quieter, something you can almost hear on the edge of the wind. A whisper of a different kind of mastery. A mastery not of others, but of yourself. The road stretches on, but your footsteps begin to slow. Not because of age. Your body is still sharp. Your reflex is still faster than a striking snake. No, it's something deeper. Something tugging at the edges of your soul, whispering that the battles you need to fight now aren't out there anymore. They're inside. You start to withdraw from the life of endless dueling, not because you fear defeat, but because victory no longer feeds you. You've slain giants, you've conquered masters, and in doing so you realize the only true enemy left is yourself. You spend more time alone now, days, weeks, even months, wandering the mountains and forests in solitude. No crowds, no challenges. Just the whispering bamboo, the rushing rivers, the endless, watchful sky. The sword stays at your side, but you draw it less and less. Instead, you draw ink across paper, crafting calligraphy that flows like water. You carve wood, shaping figures not to kill, but to create. The same discipline that honed your killing edge now turns inward, honing your spirit. You study Zen Buddhism more deeply. Not in smoky temples, but on your own, through experience. You meditate under waterfalls. You fast until your body feels lighter than air. You sit in perfect stillness, hours passing like seconds. You start to understand that mastery isn't about domination. It's about harmony, balance, knowing when to strike and when not to. You realize that the perfect duel isn't the one where you crush your opponent. It's the one you never have to fight. Conflict, you see, is a wave. True mastery is stepping aside before it crashes. The wild wolf that tore through Japan's best swordsman is still inside you, but now he sits calm at the edge of your consciousness. Not caged, not broken tamed. Not by fear, but by wisdom. People still seek you out, of course, young hotheads who want to test themselves. Old masters desperate for one last taste of glory. Sometimes you fight them, sometimes you turn them away with a word, a glance. And in both you are victorious because the battle for your soul, the hardest battle of all, is when you're finally starting to win. Eventually, even the open road feels too crowded. Even the mountains are too noisy. You need somewhere quieter, somewhere where the last distractions are fame, memory. Even ambition can't find you. So you retreat to a cave. Not a grand temple, not a castle on a hill. A simple, cold, damp cave carved into the side of a lonely mountain. Its name is Rei Gando, the Spirit Rock Cave. Fitting. You bring little with you, a few scrolls, a brush and ink. Your swords, of course, but they remain sheathed, gathering dust as the days melt into months. Inside the stone walls, you are no longer Musashi the warrior. You are Musashi the student, a student of stillness, a student of death, a student of life itself. The cave teaches you differently than the sword ever did. It teaches you patience, the way the dripping water hollows the hardest stone. It teaches you humility when even the spiders spinning lazy webs above your sleeping mat seem wiser than the chatter of human ambition. And most of all, it teaches you perspective. For the first time, you truly see the duels, the victories, the shattered schools and humbled lords. They were only shadows on the wall. The real battle was never with them. It was always with yourself. You write feverishly in the dim light, crafting essays on strategy, philosophy, the mind, and the void that binds all things together. Each word is a duel against ignorance. Each sentence is a parry against ego. Your brush becomes your sword now. Swift, deliberate, merciless against falsehood. In the silence of Ray Gando, you finally hear the faint music that was always playing beneath the clash of steel, the song of mastery, a balance of understanding. People occasionally come looking for you. Curious students would be challengers, pilgrims hoping for a glimpse of the legend. Some you meet with kindness, some you send away with a few hard truths. But mostly you are alone, and you are at peace with it. Because you know now, true strength is not about defeating others. True strength is about mastering the only thing that truly matters, yourself. And deep inside, under the stone in the silence, you are winning the greatest duel of your life, one breath at a time. Inside the cold embrace of Regando Cave, with the wind sighing at the mouth like an old friend, you decide it's time. Time to pass on what you've learned. Not through another duel, not through another battle, but through words. You sit cross-legged on the bare stone, brush in hand, ink ready, and begin to write the book of 5 rings. Not a diary, not a brag sheet of your victories. A guide. A sword manual, yes, but far more than that. A map of the mind, a blueprint for mastering conflict and mastering life itself. You divide your teachings into 5 scrolls, each representing an element: earth, water, fire, wind, void. Each scroll builds upon the last, a layered strategy for anyone seeking true understanding. The Earth Book, foundations, stability. Knowing your stance, your grounding, whether in battle or in life. The Water Book, adaptability, flexibility. Moving around obstacles, flowing through challenges rather than smashing against them. The Fire Book, aggression, timing. Knowing when to strike, when to unleash force without hesitation. The Wind Book, perspective. Understanding the strengths and weaknesses of others. Not to copy them, but to better know yourself. And finally, the Void Book, the most mysterious of all. The space between thought and action. The state of pure awareness where mastery truly lives. You write plainly without flourishes. No need for grand words. Truth doesn't need decoration. Every line is hammered out like a blade on an anvil. Direct, sharp, tested in the furnace of real battle and hard-won wisdom. You don't write for fame. You don't write to impress scholars. You write because the path you've walked has shown you something precious, and it would be a crime to let that die with you. Each stroke of the brush feels like breathing life into a second self, a Musashi who will endure long after your bones turn to dust. You know, most will misunderstand it. Some will skim the surface. A few might grasp its depths, but that's enough, because mastery was never meant for the many. It is a narrow RD, walked by the few willing to endure, to suffer, to sharpen themselves against the world until they are blades in human form. And as you dot the final line on the final scroll, you set your brush down and smile. Your greatest jewel is over. Your legacy is written. The seasons turn outside the mouth of the cave. Leaves fall, rivers freeze, flowers bloom, and you feel it deep in your bones. The end is near. Not a sudden enemy to be outdueled, not a sneak attack to be parried. No, this is the one opponent no sword can defeat. Death. You greet it the way you have greeted every opponent, with calm, with respect, without fear. Your body, once lean and unbreakable, has grown slower. The hand that carved legends from air now trembles slightly when lifting a brush. The endless miles you once walked without thinking now weigh heavier on your legs. But your mind is clearer than ever. You don't cling to life like a miser clings to coins. You don't rage against the fading light. Instead, you prepare the way a true warrior does. Deliberately, honorably. You craft your own death like you crafted your jewels with precision, with dignity, with total awareness. You dress in your finest clothes, not the robes of a lord, but simple, clean garments fit for a man who has nothing left to prove. You sit cross-legged, your swords by your side, one hand on your katana, one hand resting gently on your wakizashi, not to fight, to honor. The two blades that served you through 1,000 battles deserve to bear witness to your final breath. Your students, the few you trust, gather quietly outside the cave. They watch, not with sorrow, but with reverence, because they understand this is not a death of defeat. This is the death of mastery. You close your eyes. You breathe in the mountain air, cool, sharp, alive. You feel the pulse of the earth beneath you. You feel the blood slowing in your veins. No fear, no regret. Only acceptance, only peace. In one final steady motion, you sit perfectly still and pass from this world, a warrior to the last. No drama, no desperate grasping at life. Only stillness, only strength. Miyamoto Musashi dies as he lived, undefeated, unbroken, untamed. And as your spirit drifts beyond the veil, somewhere in the far distance, 1,000 cherry blossoms drift on the wind, and the sword falls silent. Long after your body fades into the quiet earth, your name refuses to die. It clings to the mountains. It rides the rivers. It echoes in the halls of warriors and scholars alike. Miyamoto Musashi, the man who lived by no one's rules, who carved his path with blade in mind, who turned battles into art and solitude into a kingdom. They tell your story in ways both grand and strange. Some say you fought 100 men single-handedly. Some say you could slay a bird mid-flight with a single throw of a wooden sword. Some even say you were half demon, born not from a woman, but from the storm itself. You who once slept under trees with nothing but your swords and a stubborn will, now live on in ink and legend. Across scrolls, paintings, novels, plays, your book of 5 rings becomes a treasure, not just for swordsmen, but for generals, businessmen, philosophers, anyone seeking to master conflict, mastery, or even themselves. In a world that changes with every passing season, your teachings remain stubbornly true. Observe clearly, move decisively, adapt like water. Strike without hesitation. Know yourself utterly. You become more than a warrior. You become an ideal, a symbol of the eternal struggle between discipline and instinct. A reminder that true mastery is not about beating the world, but mastering the storm within. Statues are raised in your honor. Swords are named after you. Video games, manga, movies. Your spirit finds new forms you could never have imagined, sparring across screens and pages, but none of it captures the full truth. Because the real Musashi is not the man with 2 swords standing triumphant over broken foes. The real Musashi is the man in the cave, brush in hand, writing words for a future he would never see. The man who understood that strength without wisdom is hollow, that life without reflection is a blade without an edge. You are more than victories. You are more than battles. You are a path, a question, a mirror held up to anyone who dares to walk alone. And as centuries pass, as kingdoms rise and fall, one thing remains. Your story still whispers to those bold enough to listen. Walk the path. Face yourself. Become more. And somewhere, deep in the stillness between heartbeats, the spirit of Musashi smiles. If someone were to ask hundreds of years after your death, what was Musashi's greatest lesson? They might expect tales of swordsmanship, of technique, of dueling brilliance. And they wouldn't be wrong, but they wouldn't be right either. Because your greatest lesson wasn't how to win a fight. It was how to live and how to die without fear. You taught that mastery isn't just about defeating others. It's about defeating weakness within yourself, the fear of failure, the hunger for approval, the desperate need to cling to comfort and certainty. You showed that to walk the true path, you must be willing to walk it alone, without titles, without applause, without even the promise of success. You must be your own master, your own rival, your own flame in the darkness. Through your battles, through your solitude, through the simple, fierce grace of your life, you taught this unshakable truth. Strength without purpose is hollow. Skill without spirit is meaningless. Victory without honor is ash. The duels were never the point. The blood spilled, the reputation shattered. They were just echoes of a deeper struggle. The real enemy was always within the doubts, the fears, the illusions. And you conquered them not with brute force, but with clarity, with patience. With relentless, merciless honesty. Your book of 5 rings isn't a book of how to kill. It's a book on how to live strategically, wisely, and courageously. Even today, when a young fighter laces up their gloves, or a tired soul faces a crossroads, or a quiet mind searches for meaning in a noisy world, your spirit is there, not shouting, not boasting. Just standing quietly at the edge of the path, nodding once as if to say you already have everything you need. Now walk. Your life was a battle, your death was a meditation, and your legacy is a call, a challenge that stretches across centuries to anyone bold enough to hear it. Be like Musashi. Not because he never lost, not because he never feared, but because he chose every single day to master himself. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all. Before a single shot was fired, before tanks rumbled across Europe or planes screamed overhead, every army faced one universal, unglamorous challenge: feeding its soldiers without killing them in the process. Let's be honest, when we think of World War II, we imagine battles, bravery, and black and white newsreels. Rarely do we stop to ask the really gritty questions like, that guy storming Normandy at breakfast? And if so, what on earth was it? Spoiler: it wasn't pancakes. Feeding millions of men across continents wasn't just a culinary experiment. It was a logistical nightmare with a side of dysentery. Rations had to be portable, non-perishable, cheap, and preferably not make you cry after eating them. Flavor was a distant 5th priority, somewhere between won't explode if dropped and doesn't attract rats. Different nations approached the problem in different ways. The Americans tried to science their way to sustenance, producing little boxes of optimism called K-rations. The Germans, early in the war, sent troops out with hearty meat and rye, then eventually replaced it all with something resembling punishment in a can. The British clung to tea like it was holding the empire together. It probably was. The Soviets boiled cabbage like it was a sacred tradition. And the Japanese, well, they were expected to travel light and fight hard, sometimes on just rice balls and hope. Food wasn't just fuel, it was morale. A hot meal could lift spirits. A cold tin of greasy corned beef could crush them. Some soldiers developed fondness for their rations. Others swore they'd never eat a cracker again. Many dreamed not of glory or victory, but of butter, bread, and anything that didn't come wrapped in brown paper. And while generals debated strategy in war rooms, privates in foxholes were bartering chocolate for cigarettes and praying the guy next to them didn't snore through a mess call. So tonight, we're not talking about battles won or borders redrawn. We're talking about Spam, crackers, powdered eggs, and the real war between soldiers and the strange, suspicious contents of their ration tins. Because if there's one universal truth about war, it's that everyone has to eat, even if the food fights back. Alright, you're a US soldier in World War II. You've marched 10 miles, been shot at 6 times, and haven't seen a flush toilet in weeks. Your stomach is making sounds that could qualify as artillery. What do you get? The K-ration. A compact, calorie-packed cardboard miracle designed by people who clearly hadn't eaten one themselves. Let's break it down. The K-ration came in 3 boxes: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They were about the size of a small brick, and sometimes felt like one. Each box contained just enough food to technically qualify as nutrition while emotionally preparing you for combat via culinary disappointment. Breakfast kicked off a strong can of ham and eggs, which was neither hammy nor eggy. The texture. Think Spam meets drywall. Toss in rock-hard crackers, instant coffee, powdered lemonade. Why? A couple of sticks of gum for cigarettes because nothing says balanced breakfast like a Marlboro. And best of all, 1 single sheet of toilet paper. Just one. Make it count. Lunch was not better. You might get cheese spread with more chemicals than cheese, another stack of jaw-shattering biscuits, and a chocolate bar so dense it could double as tank armor. No spoon, no problem. You'd use your knife, a stick, or blind rage to scoop it out. Dinner was meat and beans, which looked like a crime scene in a can. With it, more crackers, more gum, and sometimes, if you prayed hard, a tiny fruit bar, which tasted like someone whispered the word apple over a piece of wood. Despite their taste, K-rations were nutritional marvels. Roughly 3,000 calories a day, packed with protein, fat, sugar, and just enough flavor to ensure you didn't accidentally enjoy it. Troops often swapped components like prison traders. Cigarettes for chocolate, cheese for crackers, anything to dodge the ham-egg trauma. But every now and then, you'd find a Hershey bar. Real chocolate, real comfort. For one bite, you weren't in the mud. You were back home. That alone made the rest of the ration worth tolerating. So yes, the K-ration was dry, weirdly square, and kind of tasted like water. But in the end, it was the fuel that helped win a global conflict, one questionable meat product at a time. If the K-ration was the Army's idea of a meal, then the D-ration was their idea of a survival threat disguised as dessert. The D-ration looked like a chocolate bar, came wrapped like a chocolate bar, and was issued to soldiers as a chocolate bar. But that's where the similarities ended, because this wasn't your sweet little Hershey's Kiss. No. The D-ration was engineered in coordination with the U.S. Army to do three things. 1. Not melt. 2. Last forever. And 3. Taste like absolute despair. It was roughly the size of a deck of cards and dense enough to stop a bullet. In fact, some soldiers swore it had, whether in their packs or their intestines. The ingredients were technically food, chocolate, sugar, oat flour, and a little cocoa fat. The result? A brown brick that could double as a bludgeon or emergency building material. Why was it made this way? Because it had to survive the tropics, deserts, and frozen tundras without turning into goo, and the military specifically requested it be unappetizing so soldiers wouldn't eat it unless they were actually starving. Mission accomplished. The bar was so hard that biting into it without softening it first could lead to dental emergencies. Some guys tried grating it into hot water. Others just stared at it in confusion. A few, legend says, used it to hammer tent stakes. But hey, it had calories. About 600 per bar, which could keep a man alive through a day of combat. Barely. If you were trapped behind enemy lines or stuck in a foxhole with nothing but your rifle and bad decisions, the D-ration might just save your life. Emotionally, not so much. To the Army's credit, they did eventually realize feeding troops chocolate that doubled as masonry was not great for morale. Later iterations of the D-ration got slightly softer and vaguely more edible, but the damage was done. Soldiers remembered the original bar with the same fondness one remembers dental surgery. So next time you hear someone say chocolate makes everything better, remember the D-ration, the bar that proved them wrong if the K-ration was survival food. And the D-ration was edible punishment. Then the field kitchen was a soldier's only shot at eating something warm, recognizable, and only mildly soul-crushing. Field kitchens, also known as rolling misery carts, were mobile food units pulled behind trucks or horses. They were the military's attempt at fine dining on the go. And by fine, we mean not cold and in a can. These kitchens churned out industrial-sized vats of stew, beans, gravy-like substances, and enough coffee to power an infantry division through a mild existential crisis. Meals were served cafeteria style. You'd line up with your trusty mess kit, a metal tray that looked like it belonged in a science experiment, and shuffle forward, praying the guy ahead didn't take the last ladle of something vaguely meat-colored. The food was ladled out with military precision. One scoop for you. One suspicious stare and on to the next private. The menu. It depended on where you were. In Europe, you might get cream-chipped beef on toast, affectionately and permanently renamed by the troops as SOS or stuff on a shingle, though most used a less polite S-word in the Pacific. You were lucky if it wasn't just rice and hot dog fragments swimming in broth. Coffee, though, was sacred. It was strong, bitter, and brewed in quantities large enough to reanimate the dead. Soldiers drank it hot, cold, black, or with powdered milk, as long as it kept them awake and angry. The best part of the field kitchen experience? The smell. It meant food was coming. The worst part? Everything else. Your food was served outdoors, often in rain, snow, or the kind of mud that had its own ecosystem. You sat on rocks, helmets, or the ground. There were no forks. There was no ambience, just you, your friends, and a tin of beans that might be older than your commanding officer. Still, when it was hot and vaguely chewable, field kitchen food felt like heaven. It wasn't glamorous, but in a world of chaos, bullets, and K rations, it was the closest thing to comfort food at the start of World War II. German soldiers marched into battle with swagger, clean uniforms, and something shockingly rare in wartime logistics: actual food that resembled real meals. The early war Wehrmacht ration was downright luxurious compared to what most other armies were choking down. The standard soldier's pack included rye bread, sausages, butter, cheese, canned meats, marmalade, and coffee. Well, Ersatzkaffee, which we'll discuss later with the disgust it deserves. Each soldier was expected to carry his own food for a couple of days. A noble idea until you realized how much weight that was once you added rifles, ammunition, grenades, and frostbite. Still, German rations were built around the concept of 3 hot meals a day, with field kitchens trailing behind like slightly overworked food trucks. Breakfast could be dark rye bread with jam or butter, plus that roasted acorn, faux coffee, lunch tin meat, cheese, and maybe a boiled potato or 3. Dinner, if you were lucky and not actively being shelled, might be soup or stew made from whatever was still moving that morning. Sausage, especially Metwurst and Leberwurst, was a staple. It was easy to transport, packed with protein, and vaguely comforting. Also incredibly smelly in a sealed tin, which made every trench a blend of iron, sweat, and spicy pork aroma. And of course, Germans had bread. Good bread, real bread. Soldiers often reminisce more about losing access to proper bread than about losing a warm bed. One Wehrmacht veteran described ration bread as the only softness in an otherwise very sharp war. Field kitchens backed the system up, churning out steaming pots of stews, boiled meats, and dumplings when possible. Morale was high, stomachs were relatively full, and German efficiency seemed unstoppable. But, and there's always a but, this early golden age of German rations wouldn't last. As the war expanded and supply lines stretched thin, the sausage turned sour, the bread got stale, and the once proud field kitchens were left stranded in frozen forests with nothing but frozen potatoes and patriotic memories. Still, for a brief bratwurst-filled moment, the average German soldier had something precious in war: warm food, decent coffee substitutes, and the illusion that this whole thing might be over by Christmas. As World War II dragged on and Hitler's dream of blitzkrieg glory turned into a logistical nightmare, German rations took a sharp turn straight into the land of Ersatz, the German word that basically means imitation. Or more accurately, this isn't food, but we're calling it that anyway. By 1942, things were getting creative. Real coffee? Gone. In came Azitskoffee, a charming blend of roasted acorns, chicory, sugar beet, or barley. It smelled like despair and tasted like something brewed in an old boot. It technically resembled coffee. If you never had coffee before and were very forgiving. Bread? Once dark, hearty, and soul-sustaining, it was now packed with fillers: sawdust, straw flour, potato starch, and whatever else they could legally grind into powder. You might still call it bread, but your teeth would disagree. Some soldiers joked it doubled as helmet padding. Butter disappeared too, replaced by ersatz margarine, a pale, tasteless grease that was somehow both oily and chalky. Meat became a memory. Cans of meat products started showing up. Labels didn't specify the animal, and honestly, it was better not to ask. Even sausages, that sacred pillar of German cuisine, were diluted. Horse meat entered the mix, then turnip filler. Eventually, some sausages were up to 40% plant material. Imagine biting into a bratwurst and getting a mouthful of damp newspaper. Welcome to the Reich's culinary downfall. The problem wasn't just taste. These ersatz rations lacked nutrients, calories, and morale. Troops in the east were burning thousands of calories in sub-zero weather and getting food that couldn't even sustain a dachshund. Starvation, sickness, and desperation followed. Soldiers got inventive, boiling shoe leather, bartering with locals, or raiding enemy supply lines just to get something real. A single American chocolate bar was worth more than a stack of Wehrmacht bread. What had begun as an efficiency The fuel-powered war machine was now being run on cabbage water and caffeine lies. The Germans had started with real food. Now they were chewing misery and washing it down with roasted roots. If there was a place where food went to die during World War II, it was the Eastern Front. Stretching thousands of miles from Berlin to the deep frozen belly of Russia, the Eastern Front was the logistical equivalent of trying to run a pizza delivery service across a glacier while being shot at. Shelled and occasionally eaten by wolves, German soldiers who once feasted on sausage and rye found themselves crouched in snow drifts with frozen fingers and empty stomachs. Rations shrank, supply lines collapsed, and morale thawed faster than the soup, which is to say, not at all. Let's talk about that soup. Meal on the Eastern Front often meant hot water with a few potato peels, if you were lucky. If you weren't, it was just water frozen solid by the time it got to you. Bread. It arrived moldy or not at all. Meat. Rumor only. Soldiers burned precious firewood, not to warm themselves, but to thaw their canned meat products, which might have been beef, pork, or recycled optimism. And God help you, if the label had worn off, you'd have to sniff your way through the mystery. In winter, men boiled snow for drinking water, heated tins over engine blocks, and sometimes ate snow out of desperation, would sound harmless until you realize it lowers your core body temperature and brings you one step closer to freezing to death with a mouthful of slush. Then there were the rats, bold, fat, and suspiciously well-fed. Some units resorted to catching and cooking them. Others considered the rats rivals, stealing scraps from each other in midnight battles that historians mercifully don't teach in classrooms. Desperation also led to bartering. Soldiers traded cigarettes for bread, buttons for sugar, or a pair of socks for half a boiled potato. A single spoonful of jam could start a fight. If you had chocolate, you were a god. Despite the hunger, the cold, and the lack of anything resembling a balanced meal, soldiers endured. They joked, swore, and ate whatever they could scrounge. But every mealtime became a grim ritual. Unwrap the tin, say a silent prayer, and hope it didn't bite back. On the Eastern Front, food wasn't just scarce. It was a cruel game of survival, played one frozen spoonful at a time. If German troops on the Eastern Front were eating misery, Soviet soldiers were chewing on sheer willpower. The Red Army's approach to nutrition was simple. If it filled the stomach and didn't kill you immediately, it was dinner. The official rations, black bread, cabbage soup, buckwheat porridge, kasha, a few boiled potatoes, maybe dried fish, and the ever-reliable unsweetened tea. In winter, that tea was usually melted snow with a twig in it. Meat was listed on paper. Yes, in reality, as rare as a warm bath in Stalingrad. When meat did arrive, it was often salted to the point that chewing it was more of a jaw exercise than a meal. Still, it was considered a luxury. Soldiers licked the fat off old meat tins just to savor the memory. And then there was the bread, a staple of every Soviet meal. It was coarse, black, and made from whatever grain was still legal to eat. It was also strictly rationed. A typical serving could fit in your palm and be gone in 2 bites if you didn't try to save it by licking it slowly like a sad war lollipop. Cabbage was the hero of Soviet cuisine. Soup, stew, stuffed, shredded, or fermented. If there was a pot, there was cabbage in it. So much cabbage, in fact, that some Soviet soldiers joked they smelled it in their sleep and dreamed of becoming turnips just to escape the cycle. Still hungry. Good. Now you understand the Soviet wartime diet. Soldiers routinely went into combat, underfed and overexerted. Rations were supposed to be delivered daily, but in war-torn zones. That became when possible, which often meant never. So they improvised. Foraging became a way of life. Soldiers dug up frozen potatoes from abandoned farms, shot wild animals when they could, and bartered cigarettes or spare boots for a boiled egg. Occasionally, they even traded with German POWs, food for silence. The miracle they endured, malnourished, exhausted, but relentless. Soviet troops pressed forward on fumes and boiled cabbage, proving that sometimes what feeds a soldier isn't calories. It's pure cabbage-fueled stubbornness. When official rations ran dry, which was often, Soviet soldiers didn't starve quietly, they adapted loudly. With creativity, desperation, and occasionally the culinary sensibilities of a raccoon, Red Army troops turn battlefield improvisation into an extreme sport. Let's say you're a soldier outside Leningrad. You haven't seen a delivery truck in a week. Your cabbage soup is now just water with a floating leaf, and your last piece of black bread has grown a beard. What do? Option 1, forage. Soldiers scour the countryside for anything remotely edible. Berries, tree bark, boiled grass, dandelions, even flower bulbs. One particularly resourceful unit figured out how to roast shoe leather. Not because it tasted good. It didn't, but because it was technically organic. Option 2, barter. A spare pair of socks might earn you a potato. A broken watch, maybe a spoonful of lard. Tobacco was currency. The soap was gold. And if you had a tin of meat, you could get someone to write a letter home and clean your rifle. Option 3, theft, or as they called it, unauthorized logistics. Soviet soldiers occasionally raided abandoned German outposts just for food. One Red Army veteran recalled the sheer euphoria of finding a box of Wehrmacht sausages. The first time I cried and salivated at the same time. Field kitchens, when functional, were masters of mystery cooking. Cooks tossed in whatever they had. Beets, onions, mystery meat, pickled vegetables from 1913. The resulting soup was red, hot, and suspiciously chewy. But it kept you going. Mostly. And yet morale didn't collapse. Why? Because Soviet culture glorified suffering as proof of strength. Soldiers turned deprivation into a badge of honor. They told jokes about their rations. They sang songs about dried fish. They gave names to their tin cups, which was either camaraderie or a mild fever dream. In the Red Army, mealtime wasn't about flavor, it was about survival theater. Every bowl of borscht, every crumb of bread was a statement. We're still here. If World War II were judged solely by culinary performance, the British Army might have been forced to surrender to its own menu. British soldiers didn't eat. They endured. Their rations were a war within the war, a daily ritual of unseasoned punishment, washed down with eternal optimism and as much tea as humanly possible. Let's start with the sacred trinity. Tea, hardtack biscuits, and bully beef. Tea was everything more than a drink. It was morale in liquid form. Soldiers brewed it in tin mugs, mess tins, helmets. Anything that held heat and didn't leak too much. Sometimes there was no milk, no sugar, no dignity, just hot brown water and hope. But it got them through. Hardtack biscuits were designed to outlive the soldier. Dense, chalky, and almost completely tasteless, they had the structural integrity of roofing tiles. They doubled as plates, coasters, or makeshift armor in a pinch. Many troops claimed their dental issues weren't from combat, but from trying to bite these biscuits. Then came bully beef, aka tinned corned beef. It had the visual appeal of canned cat food and the consistency of congealed regret. It was salty, oily, and could be eaten hot, cold, or with the appropriate level of emotional numbness. You sliced it, fried it, diced it, just stared at it, until your appetite left the tin. Also included in the standard ration powdered eggs, which somehow tasted nothing like eggs, tin jam, which could glue your jaw shut, and a smattering of oatmeal, chocolate, and dried fruits, all of which arrived in tins that took a crowbar and a prayer to open. The British Army didn't pretend its food was good. It pretended it was sufficient, and in fairness, it kept soldiers alive. Barely. Field kitchens could sometimes provide stews, stewed prunes, and occasional surprise. A real egg, a slice of bread, or something not immediately depressing. But no matter the food, there was always tea. Shells could fall, trucks could explode. But if there was hot water, there was a brew. And in that mug, steaming in a muddy trench, was Britain's greatest ration of all stubbornness in a cup. By mid-war, British soldiers weren't just fighting the Axis. They were fighting ration fatigue, an invisible enemy that came disguised as another tin of corned beef. The British military supply system was held together with string, hope, and a suspicious number of forms in triplicate. Fighting across multiple continents, from North Africa to Italy to the jungles of Burma, meant rations got weirder the farther you were from London and colder and often squishier. A ration in Cairo might arrive slightly warm and edible. A ration in the Burmese jungle. It might arrive moldy, half-eaten by ants, and 2 weeks late. And still, soldiers saluted it, heated it, and ate it. Because that's what British resilience looked like, chewing quietly through despair. Water was always boiled, not just to kill bacteria, but because boiling meant tea. Tea was sacred. Men would risk sniper fire to retrieve a kettle. A warm cup could make the difference between a breakdown and a moment of British dignity in the mud. When supplies were tight, and they often were, soldiers got creative. They rehydrated powdered milk into tea whitener, spread jam on hardtack with bayonets, and seasoned meat with sarcasm. One soldier reportedly made a stew out of bully beef, raisins, and crushed vitamin tablets. The result? Morally questionable, but technically food. Tin food was both a blessing and a curse. It lasted forever, yes, but it also required strength, tools, and sometimes divine intervention to open. Soldiers developed strong opinions about tin designs and spent entire afternoons discussing the good key roll ones versus those devil tins with no handles when something fresh did show up. An egg, a loaf of bread, an actual vegetable. It was cause for celebration or suspicion. One soldier, upon receiving a fresh tomato, stared at it for an hour before deciding to keep it as a pet. Despite the rationing, the blandness, and the biscuit-induced jaw pain, British troops remained stoic. They grumbled with dignity, made jokes about their own digestion, and above all, kept calm and carried on, preferably with tea. If the American soldier had rations, the German had organization, and the Brit had tea, the Japanese soldier had rice and a terrifying capacity for suffering. The Imperial Japanese Army was built on endurance. Soldiers were taught that self-denial was noble and that hunger was part of their duty, which was convenient because most of them were perpetually starving. The standard Japanese field ration wasn't so much a meal as it was a polite suggestion. The typical pack contained white rice, barley, dried fish, pickled plums, umebashi, soy sauce concentrate, and maybe a few hard candies. It was compact, culturally familiar, and in the field, utterly insufficient. At first, troops set out with multi-day rations wrapped in wax paper or stored in bento-style metal tins. It looked neat, organized, thought out, and then they got to the jungle. In places like New Guinea, Burma, and Guadalcanal, the humidity turned rice into moldy goo. Rats ate through supplies, and fish went bad faster than your hopes of victory. To make matters worse, Japan's military logistics were, generously speaking, a disaster. Supply lines were stretched, bombed, blocked, or forgot to exist altogether. Many units went days, even weeks. With barely a handful of rice to split between them, soldiers foraged, raided villages, or ate jungle plants whose nutritional value ranged from slightly helpful to hallucinate, then collapse. In more desperate cases, they hunted lizards, insects, or even rats. One soldier claimed they made a soup out of boiled grass and boot leather to keep the stomach from shouting. To their credit, or perhaps horror, Japanese troops rarely complained. They believed hardship was honorable, starving, glorious, barefoot. Inspirational rice infested with weevils and added protein. There was occasionally miso paste or powdered green tea. These were prized and hoarded like wartime treasure. A teaspoon of tea could lift spirits. A pinch of salt could bring someone to tears. But overall, calories were low. Suffering was high. And morale often came from sheer cultural discipline, rather than what passed for a meal. The Japanese soldier wasn't just underfed, he was trained to be okay with it, and somehow many of them kept fighting. Not because of what was in their bellies, but because of what was in their minds. The jungles of the Pacific looked lush and green in the distance, like a tropical paradise, assuming you ignored the disease, the leeches, and the smell of slow death. But for soldiers on both sides, especially the Japanese, the jungle wasn't a source of food. It was a leafy green death trap with humidity and attitude. Supply lines in the Pacific were notoriously unstable. Tropical storms, naval blockades, enemy ambushes all conspired to make every delivery of rice, beans, or salt fish an act of divine luck. And when the food didn't come, the jungle was not your friend. Many Japanese units found themselves cut off from resupply for weeks. Soldiers had to rely on the land, which would have been fine if the land had any idea what they were doing. Unfortunately, the jungle was filled with plants that looked edible but weren't, animals that were edible but too fast, and insects that were not only inedible but actively aggressive. Rations spoiled in hours, canned goods rusted shut. Rice grew mold faster than you could light a fire. One soldier in Guadalcanal wrote, Everything here is wet. Even my appetite is damp. What do they eat? When lucky, boiled roots, wild fruit, frogs, or jungle fowl if they could catch it. When unlucky, tree bark, shoe leather, rotting palm stems, or water flavored with desperation. Stories exist of soldiers boiling the same handful of rice 3 times to extract every last shred of sustenance. Others fermented what was left into a starchy, half-dead porridge known only as jungle glue. And then there were the horrifying rumors, accounts of cannibalism amongst starving units, especially during sieges. It wasn't widespread, but it did happen. Men driven to the edge by war, isolation, and the shrieking emptiness of their stomachs. If anything can strip away the romanticism of the Pacific theater, it's that grim little footnote. Disease followed closely behind starvation. Malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, all worsened by malnutrition. Soldiers dropped not from bullets, but from hunger and infection, slowly and invisibly. The jungle didn't care who you fought for. It didn't feed you. It didn't shelter you. It just waited for you to get tired, and then it ate you. War may destroy cities, but it also unlocks the culinary creativity of very hungry, very desperate people with bayonets and a single can of Spam. Across every front, soldiers didn't just eat rations, they negotiated with them. They bartered, swapped, stretched, crushed, fried, and sometimes worshipped the better parts. Food was fuel, but it was also a form of entertainment and occasionally a mad science experiment. In American foxholes, GIs turned K-ration crackers into improvised pancakes, mixing them with powdered eggs and coffee creamer, then frying the result over a small fire. The final product tasted like despair, but warm despair, which was at least comforting. Canned cheese melted into an oily paste over hot beans to create trench fondue. Spam sliced. Pan-fried and stacked between biscuits to make the world's saddest sandwich. Even chewing gum found new uses, sealing leaky canteens or bribing a guy with an extra cigarette. British soldiers, armed with their indestructible hardtack and mystical jars of jam, made jam buddy sandwiches by smashing 2 biscuits together with jam until their teeth gave up. One squad in North Africa famously mixed bully beef with dried fruit and called it dessert delight. Another named their nightly stew stuff because no one could identify what was in it anymore, including the cook. On the Eastern Front, Soviet soldiers used empty shell casings as soup pots, boiled cabbage in helmets, and roasted anything with legs, including once a stolen German sausage that required 3 men to defend it. Even the Japanese, with limited supplies, found ways to repurpose leftovers. Rice was refried with pickled vegetables to create onigiri-style cakes, and dried seaweed was hoarded for flavoring water when nothing else remained. These weren't gourmet meals. They were acts of wartime alchemy. Field improvisation turned boredom into morale, turned not enough into this'll do, and made a lot of food slightly less terrifying. Because when you're stuck in a trench, jungle, or ruined farmhouse, your mess kit becomes your kitchen. Your bayonet becomes a spatula. And your meal, a miracle that you survived long enough to eat it. Long after the guns fell silent, long after uniforms were packed away and medals boxed in drawers, one thing stayed with veterans of World War II, the food. Or more precisely, the memory of the food. For many soldiers, rations were more than just sustenance. They were the backdrop to trauma, camaraderie, and grief, boredom and hope. A bite of bully beef could conjure a foxhole in France. A whiff of cabbage soup brought back the frozen trenches outside Stalingrad. A can of Spam wasn't just meat. It was a moment in time. Some remembered their meals with dark humor. American vets would joke about choking down AD ration like it owed them money. British troops swapped stories of trying to trade hard-tacked biscuits with locals, only to be laughed at. One Soviet veteran claimed he couldn't eat bread for years after the war, not because he hated it, but because it felt like sacred ground. Food marked the boundaries of war. A fresh apple meant you were near a farm and maybe a peace. A hot stew from a field kitchen meant you weren't dying that day. Even bad coffee meant someone cared enough to boil water. Then there were the care packages, those precious morale-boosting gifts from home. Chocolate bars, dried fruit, powdered milk, handwritten notes tucked beside cookies. These weren't just treats. They were emotional lifelines. Some soldiers hoarded them, others shared them. A few rationed them out, one bite at a time, stretching hope across weeks of horror. And yet some flavors stuck around too long. Veterans joked that they could still taste the metal of the tin decades later. One GI swore he could still smell Spam every time it rained. Another insisted his nightmares occasionally featured powdered eggs. Because when you eat in war, you're not just feeding your body, you're anchoring your existence. You're trying to stay human in a world gone mad. And that means every meal, however bland or bizarre, becomes part of you. So next time you toss a snack in the microwave, think of those soldiers cooking with firewood, bayonets, and sheer determination. For them, every bite was survival. And the taste? It never really left. The ink was barely dry on the U.S. Constitution when the young republic found itself brewing its first major crisis, one that came not from foreign invaders or political factions, but from something far more potent: whiskey. In the early 1790s, America was broke. The Revolutionary War had left the nation buried in debt, and the new federal government, led by President George Washington and Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, needed a plan. Hamilton, ever the fiscal mastermind, proposed an excise tax on domestically produced distilled spirits, whiskey being the most common. To the urban elites and coastal merchants, it sounded reasonable. But on the western frontier, it sounded like a punch in the face from a powdered wig aristocrat out west. In places like western Pennsylvania, whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was currency. Farmers distilled their surplus grain into whiskey because it was easier to transport, less perishable, and far more profitable than raw crops. Bartering whiskey for goods and services was part of daily life. So when the federal government started taxing it, many frontier folks saw it not as a revenue measure, but as a betrayal. A reminder that power was drifting back to the same kind of distant authority they just fought a revolution to escape. To make matters worse, the tax structure itself seemed custom-built to screw over small producers. Large distilleries could pay an annual flat fee, but small-time distillers, like the ones populating the Appalachian Hills, had to pay per gallon. Translation, the little guy paid more proportionally. And with federal tax collectors showing up on horseback to enforce the new law, tensions began to boil over. At first, the resistance was petty. Inspectors were threatened, tax documents were burned, and revenue officers were politely told to get lost. But soon, politeness turned to violence. Tar and featherings made a comeback. Taxmen were chased from their homes. In one case, a revenue officer was stripped naked, tied to a tree, and had his hair cut off. Frontier justice with a splash of moonshine-fueled rage. In Washington, he was watching, silently, waiting, but not for long. Because what started as a tax protest was about to spiral into an armed uprising, one that would test the strength of the Constitution and Washington's resolve to enforce it. By 1792, the whiskey tax wasn't just unpopular, it was radioactive. In the backwoods communities of Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and Virginia, opposition was mutating from scattered grumblings into coordinated defiance. Tax collectors were becoming familiar with two sounds: the clink of broken windows and the snap of gunfire overhead. The western counties of Pennsylvania became the epicenter of what many began to call outright rebellion. Meetings were held in taverns and cabins, where kegs of homemade whiskey stood proudly next to muskets. These weren't just drunken gripes. They were organized gatherings. Locals formed militias, issued threats to federal officials, and even passed their own resolutions condemning the tax. Some refused to do business with anyone who paid for it. It was part protest, part mafia with a side of corn liquor. In 1793, things escalated further. Tax collectors and sympathizers were ambushed, whipped, and humiliated. One man was captured and paraded through town with a sign reading "Coward" huddled around his neck. It was like the Boston Tea Party, but drunker and with worse hygiene. The federal courts responded by issuing summonses to bring the rebels to justice, but good luck serving legal papers in a place where the local sheriff might be part of the mob. The region was effectively slipping into lawlessness. Local officials either turned a blind eye or quietly sided with the insurgents. President Washington, usually calm and measured, started gritting his false teeth. The Whiskey Rebellion was threatening not only public order, but also the legitimacy of federal law itself. If the government couldn't enforce its own taxes, then what was the point of a constitution? What was the point of the government? Still, Washington didn't rush. He sent federal commissioners to negotiate with the rebels, but it was like trying to serve tea at a bar fight. The rebels had already formed committees, held conventions, and in some cases talked about full-on secession. They saw themselves not as criminals, but as patriots standing up to tyranny. Meanwhile, Hamilton, ever the hawk, was whispering in Washington's ear, "You won't let these guys stomp on the Constitution? Really? After everything we just went through?" And so Washington made a decision, one that would shock the rebels, and set a historic precedent. He would raise a federal army against his own people. By 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion had become more than a backwards tantrum. It was an outright challenge to federal authority. George Washington, who had led a revolution just a decade prior, now found himself in the bizarre position of leading an army against Americans, the very citizens he helped liberate. And this wasn't some ragtag militia. Washington called upon more than 12,000 troops, nearly 3 times the size of the force he had at the Battle of Trenton. That included state militias from Maryland, New Jersey, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Many of these troops were volunteers, but others were voluntary. It was the largest federal force ever marshaled in the U.S. to that point, and it wasn't going to war with the British or French. It was marching W to put down angry farmers with pitchforks and moonshine stills. Hamilton, never one to miss a dramatic moment, rode out with the army like some powdered wig version of Patton. He was thrilled. This was his big moment to show that the federal government had teeth and wasn't afraid to bite. Washington, though reluctant, knew the stakes. The rebellion wasn't just about booze. It was about whether the United States could function as a nation. If the rebels could scare off tax collectors and defy Congress without consequences, then the Constitution might as well be used for kindling for the first and only time in American history. The president led troops in the field. Imagine the scene: the most famous man in America, astride a horse riding westward through the Allegheny Mountains, not to inspire revolution, but to crush one. His presence sent a chilling message. Rebellion would be met not with pamphlets, but with bayonets. When the army approached the heart of rebel territory in western Pennsylvania, the response was disappointing. The rebels, who had talked big in taverns and torched a few taxmen's houses, suddenly remembered they had chores to do. Most of the ringleaders vanished. Others fled into the woods or took the I-don't-know-nothing-about-nothing defense. There would be no great battle, no climactic showdown. The army had marched hundreds of miles to confront a rebellion that fizzled like flat cider. But Washington's message was loud and clear. The federal government was no joke. With the rebellion smothered before a single shot was fired in return, the soldiers turned around and headed home, and so did George Washington. But now came the mop-up, arrests, trials, and justice federal style. A handful of rebel leaders were captured, though leaders might be generous. Many of the more radical agitators had slipped away into the wilderness. What remained were a few unlucky men who got caught by bad timing or bad hiding spots. 20 were eventually brought to Philadelphia to stand trial for treason. The trials, however, didn't unfold like Hamilton might have dreamed. Evidence was spotty. Witnesses were afraid to testify, and the jury, composed of their fellow Pennsylvanians, wasn't exactly keen on throwing their neighbors into a noose. In the end, only 2 men were convicted of treason, and even that verdict came with a side of skepticism. These weren't dangerous warlords. They were poor farmers who had made poor decisions, and Washington, no stranger to rebellion himself, chose mercy over vengeance. In a move that stunned some and reassured others, he pardoned both men. His message? Yes, the government would enforce the law, but it would not become a tyrant in the process. This act of clemency turned out to be as important as the show of force itself. Washington had demonstrated strength, but he also showed restraint. The federal government wasn't going to crush people under its heel like a monarchy might have. Instead, it would lead by law, tempered with justice. Meanwhile, Hamilton grumbled. He wanted more heads to roll, metaphorically, if not literally. He saw the rebellion as proof that the common folk couldn't be trusted with too much freedom, especially not with whiskey involved. But Washington understood the deeper game. Legitimacy didn't come from cracking skulls. It came from showing that the new republic could balance authority with compassion. The rebellion was over, but the precedent it set would echo for generations. The U.S. had passed its first real test of federal authority, and it didn't collapse into chaos. Still, questions remained. Would future presidents use the same logic? Would mercy always follow power? And most of all, was this the end of frontier rebellion, or just the beginning? The guns were holstered, the rebels pardoned, and the whiskey stills quietly resumed bubbling in hills. But politically, the Whiskey Rebellion left a hangover that would last for years. The event had proven that the federal government had the power to enforce its laws, but it also lit the fuse on deep political divisions that were already smoldering beneath the surface at the heart of the conflict. There were two opposing visions of America. On one side stood Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists, lovers of order, commerce, strong central government, and powdered wigs that could stop a bullet. They saw the rebellion as proof that the unruly countryside needed firm management. On the other side were the Jeffersonian Republicans, who didn't trust centralized power one bit. They believed in the yeoman-farmer local control. In resisting the kind of government overreach, they'd fought a revolution to escape. To them, the federal response to the Whiskey Rebellion wasn't a heroic act of law enforcement. It was overkill. Sending 12,000 troops after some farmers with barrels of corn mash felt like stomping on a fly with a cannon. Thomas Jefferson, then serving as Washington's vice president, didn't hold back his opinions. Privately, he referred to the federal march as a monarchical adventure. He believed that Washington's show of force only pushed the common man further away from the government and straight into the arms of the Republican cause. And indeed, in the aftermath of the rebellion, something curious happened. The Republican Party began to gain traction. Out on the frontier, where distrust of federal authority had been fermented like whiskey itself, support for Jefferson's ideals surged. These weren't just drunk and angry farmers anymore. They were voters, and they were angry about being treated like a bunch of criminals for refusing a tax they could barely afford. The rebellion had failed militarily, but it succeeded in galvanizing anti-federalist sentiment. It helped accelerate the formation of the first true political parties in America, sharpening the divide between those who wanted strong, centralized state and those who wanted the states to call their own shots. So, while no war had broken out, a new kind of battle had begun. One fought not with muskets and torches, but with ballots, speeches, and ideology. At its core, the Whiskey Rebellion wasn't just about booze. It was about power and class resentment. To the small farmers of western Pennsylvania and beyond, the whiskey tax was more than an annoying expense. It was a symbol of everything they feared about the new federal government, that it would be run by elites. For elites at the expense of the working poor, most of the rebellion's participants weren't outlaws. They were veterans of the Revolutionary War, men who had fought and bled for a republic they now felt was turning its back on them. They returned from battlefields to discover that the very government they helped establish was now squeezing them dry, all while cozying up to Eastern bankers and merchants. It was like fighting a lion, only to come home and get kicked by the house cat. To make matters worse, many frontier folk felt deliberately excluded from political participation. Representation was lopsided. Their voices were drowned out by wealthier urban politicians who had no idea what life was like west of the Appalachians. Add to that a tax that disproportionately punished small producers, and the whole thing smelled less like economic policy and more like class warfare. With the stink of whiskey, there was also the matter of how the law was enforced. Wealthier distillers could afford lawyers, paperwork, and the annual flat fee. The poor guy with one still and 6 barrels of mash. He got a federal marshal and a potential prison sentence. The optics were terrible, and the anger was real. In this way, the rebellion was an early warning sign. Class tension wasn't going to disappear, just because America had a constitution. If anything, the struggle between wealthy power centers and rural working communities was baked into the cake. The Whiskey Rebellion was just the first slice. Interestingly, some of the most radical rebels even adopted the language of the French Revolution, which was happening around the same time. They spoke of liberty, tyranny, and the rights of man. To Washington and Hamilton, that kind of rhetoric was terrifying. The last thing they wanted was a Paris-style bloodbath spilling into the Ohio Valley. But to the whiskey rebels, those words weren't dangerous. They were a promise, one they felt had already been broken. George Washington's decision to personally lead troops into western Pennsylvania was as bold as it was risky. At the time, many Americans saw the presidency as a somewhat distant, almost ceremonial role, a sort of executive moderator for a government still figuring itself out. But with this march, Washington shattered that image. He was no passive figurehead. He was an active enforcer of federal power. For Washington, the Whiskey Rebellion was a test not just of law and order, but of the very legitimacy of the federal system. He had helped design the Constitution, and now he was putting it to work. If he failed, if he allowed violence and intimidation to override legislation, the whole project might unravel. 13 separate states could quickly decide they were better off going their own way. The rebellion in that light wasn't just a backwoods tantrum. It was the canary in the Democratic coal mine. Washington's personal involvement added enormous weight. His reputation was nearly mythical. He was the father of his country, a man revered by veterans, respected by citizens, and feared by enemies. When word spread that Washington himself was riding W, many rebels melted into the landscape. Some couldn't believe it. Washington was the hero of liberty. Now he was marching on citizens over whiskey. But the gamble paid off. Washington didn't need to fire a single shot to win. His presence alone restored order, and he knew when to stop. Once the rebellion dissolved, he withdrew. He didn't occupy the region, didn't punish the masses, didn't turn it into a show trial. He just reminded everyone firmly that the law was not optional. Yet not everyone applauded. Some, especially in the Jeffersonian camp, accused Washington of using military force to silence legitimate political dissent. They painted the march as an overreaction, a flex of executive muscle that could have turned ugly fast. Even some Federalists worried. What precedent had just been set? Still, the rebellion's swift collapse allowed Washington to exit the presidency on a high note. He had enforced the law without becoming a tyrant. He had shown strength without cruelty. But quietly, Washington understood this wouldn't be the last time America's unity would be tested, and next time the outcome might not be so bloodless, although the Whiskey Rebellion ended with barely a whimper. Its echoes rippled far and wide politically, legally, and culturally. In hindsight, this dusty conflict over distilled grain was one of the most important constitutional stress tests in the U.S. history. First, it set a critical precedent. The federal government had the right and the ability to enforce its laws, even in the face of violent opposition. Before this, the Constitution had been more theory than reality. The Articles of Confederation had shown how weak and toothless a decentralized government could be, and now the Constitution, with Washington's boots on the ground, flexed its newfound muscles. But with that power came a lingering fear. Many Americans, especially in rural areas, began to see the federal government not as a representative of their will, but as a distant Eastern elite that didn't understand or care about frontier life. The very same people who had once cheered the revolution now whispered about oppression from Philadelphia and New York instead of London. Culturally, the Whiskey Rebellion became legend in the Appalachian Hills. Stories were passed down of brave distillers standing up to federal agents. Some were exaggerated, some romanticized, but all carried the same message. The government doesn't always have your back. And if you want something done, sometimes it takes more than a vote. It is still a rifle and a few angry neighbors. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., a new capital being planned during the rebellion's aftermath, lawmakers were taking notes. Future leaders would reference the Whiskey Rebellion every time civil unrest threatened the balance of the republic. Was this the model? A rapid show of force followed by clemency, or a dangerous precedent of executive overreach? And then there was the whiskey itself. Ironically, despite the rebellion's failure, the tax never worked. It was expensive to enforce, widely evaded, and politically poisonous. By the early 1800s, under Jefferson's presidency, it was quietly repealed. The rebels lost the battle, but in some twisted way, they'd won the war of public opinion. The frontier didn't forget. Neither did the government, and future presidents would face their own rebellions, both large and small, with the ghost of 1794 riding just behind them, reminding them that order is fragile and that the republic is always one barrel away from boiling over. The Whiskey Rebellion may seem like a curious footnote today, a quirky chapter in the early American story, but its legacy remains surprisingly alive, swirling like vapor off a still, influencing everything from presidential power to rural resistance for one. It showed the American people that the Constitution wasn't just parchment and promises. It had muscle. This was the first time the federal government enforced a domestic law with troops, and the fact that it did so under the personal leadership of George Washington gave it historical gravity. Every president since has inherited that precedent. Lincoln, Eisenhower, even recent presidents deploying the National Guard during domestic unrest, all trace a faint line back to 1794, and a president on horseback. The rebellion also injected lasting skepticism into the heart of American politics. Frontier distrust of centralized government became a core part of U.S. political identity. It didn't matter that the rebellion failed. It proved to millions that distant elites could and would flex their power when it suited them. That spirit of rural defiance. You can still hear it in anti-tax protests, states' rights arguments, and the deep American love of local control. In short, the rebellion planted seeds of resistance that never quite died out. They just fermented. Whiskey itself, believe it or not, also reaped a strange legacy. Far from being demonized, it became a symbol of independence and grit. The very substance that sparked a rebellion is now toasted in bars as a proud American tradition. In fact, the American whiskey industry, especially bourbon and rye, wears its rebellious roots like a badge of honor. You'll find distilleries named after rebellion leaders, bottles designed to evoke frontier spirit, and slogans that practically dare the IRS to come knocking again. And finally, the event taught a young country something fundamental. How it responds to dissent says everything about its identity. Washington chose both force and forgiveness. That balance, power tempered by principle, became a cornerstone of the American ideal. Not always followed, of course, but always referenced. So next time you raise a glass of bourbon or rye, remember, it's not just liquor in that bottle. It's a story of power, protest, and a young republic figuring out what kind of country it was going to be. Cheers to the rebellion that helped define a nation. Around 1754 BCE, King Hammurabi of Babylon etched his now famous code into a massive basalt stele, a towering legal monolith meant to or subjects and assert divine justice. It's one of the earliest known attempts to formalize laws in human history, but buried within its 282 articles lies something just as ancient as law itself, the regulation of women. In Hammurabi's Babylon, a woman wasn't just a person, she was a role model. Wife, widow, mother. Each of those roles came with a legal definition, a social expectation, and if things went sideways, a punishment. For example, take marriage. Women could be married off by their fathers, essentially transferred from one household to another. Once married, a woman was expected to be faithful. If she was accused of adultery, both she and her alleged lover could be bound and thrown into a river. That's not a metaphor. That's literally what the text prescribes. However, if her husband decided to spare her life, the court often agreed. Romantic in a grim sort of way. Meanwhile, if a man cheated on his wife, Hammurabi didn't seem all that concerned. Male infidelity wasn't exactly headline news in Mesopotamia. The imbalance was stark. Female honor was family honor, while male honor was more flexible. But not all the laws were oppressive. Some provisions offered women surprising protections, especially widows. A widow had the right to remain in her late husband's house and manage his property until her sons came of age. If there were no sons, she could even inherit directly. In that way, Hammurabi's code recognized a woman's capacity for financial and legal responsibility, but only within the strict bounds of family structure. There were also laws about divorce. A woman could leave her husband if he was cruel or neglectful, but proving it was no small task. If her claims couldn't be verified, she could be branded a liar and punished severely. Justice wasn't blind. It just squinted harder when the accused wore a veil. So what did Hammurabi's code teach us about women in ancient Babylon? That they weren't invisible. Far from it. They were named, categorized, judged, and occasionally protected, but always through the lens of control. Law gave them a place, but rarely the power to shape it. Travel a few 100 miles west from Babylon and fast forward a few centuries, and you arrive in ancient Egypt, a civilization where the scales of justice were personified by Maat, the goddess of truth, balance, and cosmic order, and unlike many of their neighbors, the Egyptians had a surprisingly progressive view, at least on paper, when it came to women's legal rights. Egyptian women, whether rich or poor, had the legal right to own property, inherit land, sue and be sued, and even initiate divorce. These weren't just theoretical rights etched on tomb walls. They were practiced, particularly in urban centers like Thebes and Memphis. Women could enter contracts, serve as witnesses, and leave wills. A woman could run a business, lend money, or purchase slaves and livestock. In short, Egyptian law recognized women as legal individuals, not just extensions of their husbands. This autonomy might seem ahead of its time, and in many ways it was. Women weren't locked out of temples or courts. In fact, priestesses played important legal and ritual roles, and some even served as judges or scribes. Legal documents from the New Kingdom show women filing complaints against male relatives and winning. But, and there's always a but, this relative legal freedom came with social constraints. Most women still lived under the authority of a father or husband, and while they could own land, they were often expected to pass it down through male heirs. The law said yes, but society often said not quite marriage. Though not a religious institution in Egypt, it was still legally binding. Husbands and wives could divorce for reasons as varied as infertility, infidelity, or even emotional incompatibility. Divorce didn't carry a social stigma, and children were usually cared for by the mother, who retained rights to her dowry and often received additional property. Punishment under the law was theoretically equal, but practically speaking, class and connections mattered far more than gender. A noblewoman could get away with things that would send a peasant woman straight to the crocodiles. Literally. So was ancient Egypt a feminist utopia? Not exactly. But compared to the rigid patriarchies of Mesopotamia or later Greece, it offered women something rare, the ability to participate in legal life as people, not just property in a world ruled by gods and pharaohs. That was no small thing. In ancient India, the legal world of women was governed by dharma, the moral and social order at the heart of Hindu philosophy. Codified in texts like the Manusmriti laws of Manu, this framework offered a deeply hierarchical and duty-driven system where women were honored, protected, and respected so long as they stayed in their place. The Manusmriti, compiled sometime between 200 BCE and 200 CE, had a lot to say about women, much of it contradictory. On one page, it declared that where women are honored, the gods rejoice. On another, it warned that a woman must never be independent. The tone swung between reverence and restriction, between divine praise and domestic captivity. Women were legally bound to male guardians throughout their lives. Father during childhood, husband during marriage, and sons during widowhood. This triad of male control wasn't just cultural, it was encoded into law. Autonomy was not the ideal. Obedience was. Marriage laws were especially rigid. A woman's primary duty was to marry, bear sons, and serve her husband faithfully. Widow remarriage was generally frowned upon or outright banned, depending on the caste and period. Sati, the infamous practice where widows were expected to throw themselves onto their husband's funeral pyre, was not universally enforced, but found moral validation in some legal and religious texts. The Manusmriti didn't command it, but it also didn't condemn it. That said, there were exceptions. Women of the upper caste sometimes received education and could inherit property in the absence of male heirs. In some regions and periods, matrilineal traditions survived, particularly in the South. Women could serve as advisors, poets, and even rulers, though these were rare and usually exceptional. Divorce was rare and generally disapproved of, though certain grounds like impotence, cruelty, or abandonment were sometimes recognized still. It was the man who had more legal freedom to cast aside a marriage. Punishments, too, were gendered. A woman caught in adultery could be disfigured or outcast. A man, he might get a fine or a slap on the wrist if he had high status. In short, ancient Hindu law wrapped women in layers of veneration and restriction. They were sacred, but sacred like a temple statue, not like a free citizen. Revered, but rarely empowered. When we think of ancient Greece, we often imagine democracy, philosophy, and drama. But for half the population, women, the legal system was less about ideals and more about invisibility. Especially in classical Athens, women were legally seen not as individuals, but as permanent minors, bound to the guardianship of their nearest male relative for life. In Athenian law, women couldn't vote, own property independently, or represent themselves in court. They could not enter contracts or even leave the house without a male escort. In many cases, if the Code of Hammurabi defined women as legally subordinate, Athens perfected the art of locking them out entirely. Marriage was more of a property transaction than a romantic union. A woman's Kyrios, usually her father or brother, arranged her marriage, and she moved into her husband's household as part of an exchange of dowries and land. Legally, she was transferred like livestock, a living, breathing asset passed between men. And yet, paradoxically, her fidelity was of enormous legal importance. If an Athenian woman committed adultery, her husband could legally divorce her immediately, and any man caught with her could be executed. Yes, executed without trial. The irony? Her husband could sleep with courtesans or slaves without legal repercussions. Double standards weren't just common. They were built into the legal structure. Women couldn't initiate divorce themselves, but they could return to their father's house if abandoned or mistreated. However, any legal action on their behalf had to be taken by a male relative. Even in cases of rape or assault, a woman could not bring charges. Her Kyrios had to speak for her. There were exceptions. In Sparta, women enjoyed more freedom. They could own land, receive education, and walk freely. But Spartan women were the anomaly, not the rule. In most city-states, a respectable woman's name was supposed to be spoken as little as possible. The ideal woman was modest, silent, and invisible. And yet, in the shadows of Greek law, women endured. They raised generations, managed households, and in some rare cases, wielded influence from behind the veil of legality. But officially, they weren't citizens. They were shadows in a system that prized logic and liberty from men only. In the world of ancient Rome, the law was a powerful instrument, and like everything else Roman, it was deeply structured, hierarchical, and pragmatic. Roman women weren't equal citizens by any stretch, but compared to their Greek counterparts, they occupied a slightly more visible and legally complex space within society. At birth, a Roman woman fell under the patria potestas, or the absolute authority of her father. Upon marriage, that authority could either transfer to her husband, manus marriage, or remain with her natal family, sine manu marriage. The latter became increasingly common over time and allowed married women to retain legal ties to their original household, and even manage property independently. In some cases, this shift opened the door for women, especially widows or wealthy daughters, to own estates, manage businesses, and draft contracts. While women could not vote or hold office, they could sue in court, often with a male sponsor, act as guardians, and accumulate wealth. Still, Roman law drew a firm line around female behavior. The ideal Roman woman was penica modest, loyal, and obedient. Adultery, once treated as a private offense, became a public crime under Augustus's moral reforms. A woman found guilty could lose her dowry, face exile, or worse. Meanwhile, a man's infidelity remained legally unproblematic. Again, patriarchy rarely missed a chance to double down. However, unique roles offered exceptions. Vestals, the virgin priestesses of Vesta, were the only women legally free from male guardianship. They swore 30 years of chastity in exchange for immense prestige, legal independence, and the power to pardon condemned prisoners. But a broken vow of chastity meant being buried alive. Divine authority came with cruel consequences. Roman matrons, respectable married women of the upper classes, held significant social power. They influenced politics through family connections, arranged marriages, and even public mourning rituals. The legal system acknowledged their status through protections for property and legal mechanisms like tutela, a type of male guardianship that by the imperial period was often symbolic. So while Roman women lived within a legal cage, the bars were spaced just far enough apart to allow movement, especially for those born into wealth and prestige. They were constrained, yes, but never entirely silenced. In ancient Hebrew society, law wasn't merely a civic structure, it was divine instruction. Found in the Torah and later interpreted by rabbis, these religious legal texts created a framework that governed every aspect of life, including the roles, rights, and restrictions placed on women. And like many ancient systems, the law both elevated and limited them. At the heart of Hebrew law was the family unit, with women expected to serve as the moral and spiritual backbone of the household, but always under male authority. Fathers arranged marriages. Husbands were heads of households. Sons inherited land. Daughters, by contrast, were expected to marry out and bring a dowry with them, often with no inheritance rights unless there were no sons. However, women were far from voiceless. The ketubah, a marriage contract, gave them legal security in the form of promised financial support and spelled out responsibilities in marriage. If a man failed to provide food, clothing, or intimacy, a woman could seek divorce, a rare provision in the ancient world. But she couldn't initiate it directly. A rabbinic court or her male kin had to advocate on her behalf. Adultery laws were starkly unequal. A married woman caught with another man could be stoned to death. According to Deuteronomic law, a man caught with a married woman, same punishment. But if the woman was unmarried or a slave, the rules became murkier, usually resulting in fines or marriage, depending on the social status involved. In cases of rape, the law demanded a fine and marriage to the victim, an outcome that modern readers understandably find deeply problematic. Ritual purity laws also played a massive role in how women were legally perceived. During menstruation or childbirth, women were considered ritually impure and were temporarily restricted from religious life and physical contact. These laws reinforced ideas of female otherness, not necessarily as sinful, but as symbolically set apart. And yet the Hebrew Bible is full of strong, legally significant women. Deborah the judge, Ruth, the Moabite widow who navigates the inheritance system, and Esther, who bends royal law to save her people. These women were rare, but their presence reveals that the law wasn't always airtight, and that boldness, wisdom, and faith could sometimes make space where the law had closed the door. The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, ruled over a vast, diverse population, from Babylonians and Egyptians to Greeks and Medes. And in that sprawling empire, Persian law operated with a level of tolerance and pragmatism uncommon in many ancient societies. This legal flexibility extended in interesting ways to women. While Persian law wasn't codified in a single monument like Hammurabi's Code, administrative records, court documents, and inscriptions reveal that women, especially elite women, had considerable legal presence. In particular, Persian royal and noble women were among the most autonomous in the ancient world. In the royal court, women like Atassa, daughter of Cyrus the Great and mother of Xerxes, wielded immense influence. She controlled vast estates, issued commands to administrators, and appeared in imperial inscriptions not as decorative figures, but as landowners and power players. Records from the Persepolis fortification tablets show women receiving rations, managing work crews, and overseeing production in royal estates. These weren't isolated cases. High-ranking women, especially those close to the king, had legal authority over labor and property. Marriage and family law in Persia combined local customs with overarching imperial oversight. In Persian society, women could own property, enter contracts, and inherit land rights that were sometimes even more secure than in Greece or Rome. Dowries were legally protected, and women could reclaim them if the marriage ended. Divorce was possible for both men and women, though the process often leaned in favor of the husband unless serious abuse or infertility could be proven. Punishment laws, however, were still gendered. Adultery was a capital offense, especially for women. But unlike in some neighboring cultures, the method and severity of punishment varied by class. A noble woman might face exile or house arrest, while a servant could be executed. The law has always vowed to hierarchy. Zoroastrianism, the empire's dominant religion, also influenced Persian views on women. While spiritually both men and women had roles in cosmic dualism, practical religious purity laws imposed restrictions on menstruation, childbirth, and bodily contact, echoing patterns seen in Hebrew and Hindu systems. In all, Persian law offered women a curious mix: freedom through rank, respect through religion, and limits through custom. The higher your status, the louder your legal voice. In ancient China, law was not just a system of rules. It was an expression of harmony, hierarchy, and Confucian morality. And for women, this meant living within a legal and cultural framework that viewed them primarily through the lens of family roles and social duty, rather than individual rights. The earliest codified Chinese laws appeared during the Zhou dynasty, but it was under the Han dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, that legal structures began to crystallize alongside Confucian ideology. Confucian teachings emphasized the three obediences. A woman must obey her father before marriage, her husband during marriage, and her sons in widowhood. This wasn't just moral advice. It influenced actual legal expectations and societal norms. Women were legally subordinate to men in nearly all contexts. They could not hold public office, rarely appeared in court independently, and were often excluded from inheritance, especially in patrilineal families. The daughter might be cherished within the home, but the law saw her as temporary. She would eventually marry out, taking her dowry with her. Marriage was both a family alliance and a legal contract. A man could divorce his wife for reasons as broad as jealousy or illness, though he could not do so if she had no family to return to, had mourned his parents properly, or had borne him sons. Women, by contrast, had no legal power to initiate divorce unless extreme abuse could be proven, and even then, her case would likely depend on her male relatives stepping in. Adultery laws reflected strong gender bias. A woman caught cheating could be executed. A man cheating with a married woman might face punishment, but cheating with a servant or concubine, that was often overlooked entirely. Honor and legitimacy were tied tightly to the woman's womb. Still, there were exceptions. Some dynasties saw the rise of imperial women, like Empress Lu Ji and Empress Wu, who wielded immense political power, sometimes bending legal codes to suit their ambitions. And in peasant villages, widows who managed households or took over family businesses could wield informal authority, even if the law didn't formally recognize them. In short, ancient Chinese law saw women less as autonomous beings and more as stabilizers of familial order, vital to society's function, yet always second to the men who supposedly maintained its harmony. As we step back and look across the ancient world, from the ziggurats of Babylon to the palaces of Rome, from Vedic India to Confucian China, one thing becomes clear. Women were always written into the law, but rarely on their own terms. Nearly every ancient legal system assigned women a role within a male-dominated structure, whether in Hammurabi's Code or the Manu Smriti. The fundamental legal assumption was that a woman's identity was relational. Daughter, wife, mother, widow. Her rights and responsibilities flowed through the men around her. Law defined her, but it rarely empowered her. Some civilizations, like Egypt and Persia, offered women more autonomy, allowing them to own property, initiate contracts, and even inherit wealth in these societies. Noble or high-born women could carve out pockets of legal authority, sometimes rivaling their male counterparts. But such privileges were far from universal. They depended on class, family, and circumstance more than any underlying belief in gender equality. Other societies like Greece and Rome developed sophisticated legal systems while simultaneously fencing women out of public life. Greek women were legally invisible. Roman women had more agency, but still lived within a scaffold of male guardianship and social expectation. In China, Confucian values hardened the ideal of obedient femininity into legal expectation. The law wasn't just about punishment, it was about preserving cosmic harmony, and that meant everyone, especially women, knew their place in the social order. Similarly, in Hindu law, reverence for women coexisted uncomfortably with strict control and moral prescription. Religious laws such as Jewish halakha or Zoroastrian purity codes often placed women at the intersection of sacred and profane. A woman's body could bring honor or impurity, blessing or danger, depending on how closely she followed the rules. And yet, within these systems, women adapted, resisted, and endured. They found ways to exercise influence through family, faith, property, or sheer determination. Their stories may not always be carved into stone steles or echoed in ancient law courts, but they moved beneath the surface, shaping households, dynasties, and entire civilizations. Ultimately, ancient legal codes tell us not only how societies treated women, but how they defined power itself and who they believed deserved to wield it. Long before Wall Street, before vaults and banknotes and savings accounts, banking began in the mud brick cities of ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. And surprisingly, the first bankers weren't suited to be financiers. They were priests. In cities like Uruk, Lagash, and later Babylon, temples weren't just religious centers. They were the administrative and economic hearts of urban life, these towering ziggurats. And their surrounding complexes acted as both spiritual sanctuaries and financial hubs. Farmers and merchants didn't just come to pray. They came to deposit grain, receive loans, and settle debts. Why temples? because they were the most stable, trusted institutions. The gods didn't run off with your money, and the priesthood had an army of scribes to keep meticulous records. When a farmer delivered a portion of his harvest to the temple granary, he'd receive a clay tablet with a cuneiform inscription. The quantity stored, the date, the depositor's name, and sometimes a witness. This wasn't just a receipt, it was an early form of a check. These receipts could then be transferred. A farmer in debt could hand over his tablet to a creditor as repayment. A merchant could use them to buy goods or settle accounts. In this way, the clay tablet became the ancestor of promissory notes, deposit slips, and IOUs. Temples also issued loans not just in grain, but in silver, sheep, and other commodities. Interest rates were high by modern standards, typically around 20% for grain and 33% for silver. These weren't casual transactions either. Defaulting on a temple loan could lead to the loss of land, property, or even personal freedom. Interestingly, the concept of compound interest was understood and feared. Some legal codes, like those of Hammurabi, tried to limit or regulate interest practices. Others formalized debt slavery as a punishment. This was banking in its rawest, most primal form, both brilliant and brutal. So while modern banks might be glass towers and spreadsheets, their bones are ancient. The earliest financial systems weren't born in markets, they were born in temples. And in Mesopotamia, the gods didn't just judge your soul. They also balanced your books. By the time Babylon rose to power under kings like Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE, Mesopotamian banking had become more sophisticated and more personal. While temples and palaces remained important economic players, a new class of financial professionals began to emerge: private moneylenders. These early financiers weren't working out of marble lobbies. They conducted business in humble homes, market stalls, or even beside temple courtyards. But they had one thing: temples didn't have flexibility. Where temple loans were often seasonal and tied to agricultural cycles, private moneylenders could tailor deals for merchants, traders, and craftsmen, offering loans in silver, Babylon's preferred unit of currency. Silver wasn't minted into coins yet. That innovation would come much later. Instead, it was weighed out by the shekel, and loans were documented on clay tablets. These tablets detailed the borrower, lender, amount lent, interest rate, repayment date, and sometimes even collateral. If a debtor defaulted, lenders could legally seize land, goods, or even family members. Some contracts read more like threats than agreements. One fascinating innovation was the rise of joint liability loans, where two or more individuals shared responsibility for repayment. This helped reduce the lender's risk and planted the seeds for what we now call cosign loans. Debt was everywhere in Babylonian society. Farmers borrowed to plant crops, merchants borrowed to finance caravan expeditions, and builders took loans for large construction projects. Debt slavery was a real risk, but the law eventually began to push back. Hammurabi's famous code offered some relief. For example, if a storm destroyed your crops, you might be exempted from interest that season. Babylon also introduced promissory notes and letters of credit used to transfer money across distances without transporting physical silver. These tools allowed wealthy merchants to expand, trade, and move money without the risk of robbery, a protoform of the modern banking network. It's easy to think of banking as a modern system tied to stock tickers and interest rates. But in Babylon, the same mechanics, lending, collateral, interest, and risk were already shaping lives and livelihoods. Their tools were made of clay, not code, but the game was much the same. In ancient Egypt, economic life revolved around two constants: the Nile River and the pharaoh's granaries. While Egypt didn't develop a formal banking system in the same way as Mesopotamia or later Greece, it nonetheless maintained sophisticated financial practices rooted in temples, royal treasuries, and massive state-administered storage systems. Instead of coins or silver shekels, Egypt's economy was built on grain. Wheat and barley weren't just food, they were currency. Taxes, wages, and debts were often measured in sacks of grain, and these were stored in vast centralized granaries. Like Babylonian temples, Egyptian temples functioned as both religious and economic centers, serving as secure storage sites and financial record offices. Scribes recorded every delivery, withdrawal, and transaction on ostraca, pottery shards, or papyrus scrolls. These acted as receipts, contracts, and even early forms of checks. If you deposited 10 sacks of grain at the temple granary in Thebes, you might receive a receipt which could be traded or presented elsewhere to retrieve an equivalent amount, a precursor to modern bank drafts. Loans were common. A farmer might borrow seed grain to plant in the spring with a promise of repayment after the harvest, usually with interest. Rates varied, but a 2,530% interest rate on grain wasn't unusual. These loans were enforced by scribes and local officials, and default could result in the forfeiture of land, livestock, or even labor. Unlike Babylon, however, private lending in Egypt was more restricted. The state played a dominant role in organizing economic exchange. High officials, priests, and royal administrators were the main actors in large-scale financial activity. Yet there are surviving records of private individuals, especially women, acting as lenders and creditors in local communities. These cases were less common, but they demonstrate a level of grassroots financial agency not often acknowledged. Coinage was introduced only during the late period, influenced by foreign powers like the Persians and later the Greeks. But even then, Egyptians preferred grain and barter systems over metal money, proof that a functioning economy doesn't need coins, just trust, storage, and records. So while Egypt lacked the sleek columns of a Roman bank, or the aggressive contracts of Babylon, it ran a tight temple-based economy built on grain, writing, and bureaucracy, and laid the groundwork for financial infrastructure that lasted thousands of years. With the rise of city-states like Athens and Corinth in the 5th century BCE, ancient Greece introduced two financial revolutions, the minted coin and the money changer. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, where grain and silver were the dominant currencies, the Greeks embraced metal coinage as a public standard, stamped, regulated, and guaranteed by the state. This shift created a new class of financial professionals, the trapetitai, named after the trapezia or table from which they worked in the bustling agora. These men functioned as money changers, deposit takers, lenders, and sometimes outright financiers. They exchanged foreign coins, held money for safekeeping, offered loans, and even kept accounts for their clients. A rudimentary form of checking. Need to send money to another city-state? No problem. The trapezites could issue a written draft, allowing merchants to avoid traveling with heavy theft-prone coinage. If that sounds like a bank transfer, that's because it was, albeit with more sand and fewer algorithms. Lending was a huge part of Greek banking. Interest rates were generally high, especially for risky ventures like maritime trade. Some loans carried 100% interest, justified by the danger of shipwreck, piracy, or storm. These were backed by maritime contracts, which included details of the cargo, route, repayment, and collateral. If the ship sank, the loan was voided. If it returned, big profits. Private citizens could also act as lenders. Wealthy Athenians often invested in smaller loans secured by property or slaves. These transactions were documented before witnesses and scribes and could be enforced in court. In fact, Greek courts were flooded with debt cases, an early sign that money, trust, and lawsuits are eternal bedfellows. And yet banks in Greece weren't formal institutions like we'd expect today. They were more like financial freelancers with serious reputations. There were no licenses, no regulation, and no government insurance. If your trapezite skipped town with your deposit, too bad. Trust was everything, and it could be shattered in a heartbeat. Despite these risks, the Greek financial world thrived. It enabled trade, supported empire building, and even bankrolled wars. In a city where logic and debate ruled, so too did contracts, ledgers, and interest rates. Ancient Greece taught us that once you stamp a coin and assign it value, the rest follows from debt and profit to risk and ruin. By the time Rome ruled the Mediterranean, banking had evolved from small-scale loans to a full-blown financial engine that powered an empire. The Romans, even the pragmatists, didn't invent banking, but they perfected it, expanded it, and embedded it deep into the fabric of everyday life. At the heart of Roman finance were the Argentari, the Roman equivalent of bankers. These men operated out of taberni shops near the Forum and acted as money changers, deposit takers, lenders, and agents. They exchanged coins from across the empire, held private deposits for safekeeping, paid out loans, and even executed payments between third parties. Wealthy Romans, including senators, deposited large sums with these bankers who kept ledgers called rations, the ancestors of our modern account books. A client could authorize a banker to pay another person using their deposit, creating an early version of the check. Want to send money to Carthage or Alexandria? No need to pack a bag of coins. Your banker could issue a letter of credit. The real fuel behind Roman banking, however, was credit. Loans weren't just for emergencies, they were used for trade, land purchases, construction projects, even election campaigns. Lending at interest, usually around 12%, though it could be higher or lower depending on risk, was legal, though subject to regulation. Usually the charging of excessively high interest was frowned upon, but often ignored. Collateral was key land. Slaves or future earnings could all secure a loan, and Rome had robust legal enforcement. If you didn't pay your debts, you could be dragged to court, have your property seized, or in extreme cases be enslaved. Unlike earlier societies, Rome allowed corporations of financiers known as Societas Publicanorum Publicani to handle large-scale government contracts, including tax collection. These were profit-seeking enterprises with investors, managers, and shareholders, making them eerily similar to modern banks and hedge funds. Yet there were risks. Roman bankers weren't state-backed, and financial crises did happen. Records show that some banking houses collapsed, triggering waves of panic. Sound familiar? In the Roman world, money flowed through temples, forums, and estates, binding together farmers, traders, soldiers, and senators. And as the empire grew fat on conquest, its financial system stretched like invisible roads, connecting people not with stone, but with credit, debt, and interest. Before the concept of a central bank existed, the idea of state control over currency was already revolutionizing how economies function. In ancient times, the power to mint coins wasn't just economic, it was political. Whoever issued the coin held the trust of the people, and that trust became the backbone of early banking systems. The earliest coins appeared in Lydia, modern-day Turkey, around 600 BCE. Made of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, these stamped pieces marked a shift from weighed metal to standardized currency. No more measuring silver chunks in a dusty market. Now the value could be verified at a glance. Other civilizations quickly adopted the idea. The Greeks minted drachmas, the Persians issued darics, and the Romans built an entire empire on denarii. These coins bore state symbols, images of gods or rulers, and inscriptions, not just to represent value, but to signal legitimacy and control. A coin was as much a piece of propaganda as it was a financial tool. With state-backed coinage came new financial behaviors. Hoards of coins were stored in temples, households, and merchant treasuries. Lending became easier and more portable. Coins could circulate quickly across city-states, and with uniform weights and metal content, traders could move goods across borders with confidence. In turn, early bankers, from Mesopotamian lenders to Roman argentari, adapted to this new certainty. They no longer needed to test weights or purity as frequently instead. They tracked coins by type, year, and issuer. This consistency reduced transaction friction, expanded trade routes, and made loans more predictable. Coinage also played a role in inflation and monetary policy, albeit in crude forms. Rulers could debase coins by mixing cheaper metals into the mix, stretching the treasury but undermining trust. Roman emperors famously did this to pay their armies, triggering cycles of devaluation and economic instability. Still, the idea stuck. Currency backed by a state, stamped with its symbol and guaranteed in value. This concept laid the groundwork for everything from medieval gold coins to modern fiat money. In a way, each ancient coin was more than just a piece of metal. It was a promise, a contract, and a tool of the empire. It told you not only how much something was worth, but who had the power to decide. In the ancient world, the line between faith and finance was often thin, if it existed at all. Temples didn't just serve the gods. They also served as the earliest safe deposit boxes, banks, and loan offices. Why? Because people trusted the gods far more than they trusted kings, merchants, or wandering moneylenders. Take Delphi, for instance. The sanctuary of Apollo wasn't just a religious destination, it was a financial powerhouse. City-states stored war funds there, wealthy individuals deposited fortunes, and treasuries were built within temple precincts. Religious centers like Delos, Ephesus, and Jerusalem also acted as de facto banks, offering security, prestige, and scribes who kept careful records, a vault under divine watch. It was seen as safer than any home or fortress. These temples played several financial roles. They held deposits, issued loans, and in some cases even collected interest. In Mesopotamia, as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, temple priests oversaw lending systems where borrowers repaid with grain or silver. In Egypt, temple granaries stored wealth, issued receipts, and facilitated trade in Greece and Rome. Temples frequently held public funds, safeguarded spoils of war, and underwrote construction and festivals, all under the sacred seal of a deity. And temples weren't just passive vaults. They actively lent money. In Athens, for example, the Temple of Athena on the Acropolis loaned silver to the state at interest to fund major public works. Gods apparently were patient creditors. Religion also provided the ethical framework for finance. Ancient Hebrew law, for instance, prohibited charging interest to fellow Israelites, but allowed it for foreigners, a moral boundary that blended spiritual identity with economic policy. Hindu Dharma texts laid out rules for fair lending, debt repayment, and even the spiritual consequences of financial misconduct. Of course, these systems weren't without flaws. Temples could be looted in wartime. Clerics could be corrupt. But for most of the ancient world, temples were the most trusted institutions, enduring, stable, and reinforced by divine fear. So when you picture ancient banking, don't just imagine dusty coins and cloaked lenders. Picture golden statues, incense, and marble columns. Because for thousands of years, the safest place to put your money wasn't under a mattress. It was beneath the watchful eyes of the gods. Long before the invention of credit cards or mortgage calculators, ancient economies ran on a system that was surprisingly familiar. Borrow now, pay later with interest. Whether you were a Mesopotamian farmer, a Greek merchant, or a Roman senator, if you needed capital, you went to a lender. But the ancient rules of lending were often harsher, and the consequences of default far more personal. Interest wasn't just allowed, it was expected. In Babylon, rates were steep: 20% for grain, 33% for silver, often compounded annually. These figures weren't considered predatory. They were standard. High risk meant high reward, and borrowers understood that if the harvest failed or a caravan didn't return, they were still on the hook. Temples and private lenders alike made fortunes off these loans, and unpaid debt could lead to debt slavery or seizure of property. In ancient Greece, especially Athens, interest rates varied depending on the risk involved. The riskiest loans, maritime loans. A lender might front silver to fund a trading voyage, knowing the ship might sink or be seized by pirates. To offset the risk, rates could soar to 100% or more, but if the ship returned safely, both merchant and lender could make a killing. The Romans added legal muscle to these arrangements. Loan contracts were written, witnessed, and sealed. Collateral, land, goods, slaves was recorded in detail. Miss a payment, your creditor could take you to court, seize your property, or in rare cases, force you into bonded labor. Roman law set a 12% interest cap, but loopholes and exemptions made that number flexible, especially during times of economic stress. Despite the risks, borrowing was common. Farmers borrowed seed. Merchants borrowed to buy goods. Politicians borrowed to fund their campaigns. Lending greased the gears of ancient economies, and default was an accepted hazard. And yes, fraud and manipulation were part of the game. Lenders sometimes demanded bribes or added administrative fees. Borrowers could lie about collateral or disappear entirely. Without credit scores or banking regulations, trust and reputation were everything in the end. Ancient loans weren't just financial tools. They were power plays. To borrow was to risk more than money. It was to stake your land, your freedom, sometimes even your family, on the chance that tomorrow will be better, or at least profitable. From grain receipts in Mesopotamia to the silver ledgers of Rome, ancient banking wasn't just a footnote in economic history. It was the foundation, these early systems of deposits, loans, interest, and financial record-keeping didn't just fuel local trade. They quietly shaped the architecture of global finance. At the heart of every ancient banking system was the same challenge we face today: trust. Could people trust that the weight of silver was fair? That the grain in the temple granary wouldn't spoil or vanish? That the lender wouldn't disappear with their deposit? And out of that trust, or the desperate need for it, rose record-keeping contracts and ultimately institutional finance. The innovations were astonishing for their time. Ancient Babylonians developed loan contracts with fixed interest, repayment terms, and legal witnesses, all inscribed in cuneiform. Ancient Greeks pioneered letters of credit, allowing funds to be transferred between city-states without carrying coins. The Romans created bankers' associations and formalized debt enforcement in civil law, building a financial system that could stretch from Britain to Syria. Even today, echoes of ancient banking remain. The modern check evolved from Mesopotamian clay receipts. The concept of collateralized loans is rooted in Babylonian and Roman practices. Central banking and monetary policy trace their ancestry back to rulers who manipulated coin purity or temple wealth to fund armies and public projects. And what about regulation? Well, it turns out ancient societies understood financial crises all too well. In Babylon, kings periodically declared debt forgiveness to prevent social collapse. Roman emperors sometimes imposed interest caps to curb predatory lending. These weren't just economic decisions. They were political acts aimed at keeping society balanced and stable. But perhaps the greatest legacy of ancient banking is the realization that finance is not new. The tools have changed. Clay tablets became spreadsheets. Silver shekels became digital currencies. But the fundamental human behaviors remain: risk, ambition, trust, fear, and the hope of gain. The next time you log into your bank app or swipe a credit card, remember you're not doing anything new. You're participating in a system that began with scribes in temples, coins stamped by kings, and farmers betting their harvest on a better season. And it all began with a simple idea. Sometimes to build the future, you have to borrow from it.